I already introduced myself. I'm Billy Riggs. I'm a professor here, assistant professor of public administration at University of San Francisco. We could not be more excited to host this event. I'm here. This is my co-chair, Michael Boswell. We have been talking about this event for the last 3 years since we began working on this topic in 2014, 2015. At that time, we were both at Cal Poly San Luis Obispo, and we could not be more excited to have you here. University of San Francisco is very committed from even the president's level. President Father Fitzgerald, since his regrets he could not be here, but we are committed to sustainability in a socially just city, and starting that here at USF and in San Francisco is a big part of what we wanted to try to do by bringing all of these amazing people together and by having all these amazing sponsors. So Mike and I could not be more grateful. Organizing committee, I could not thank you enough, and you will be recognized a little later. But before we do that, I just want to invite Dean Elizabeth Davis up to give a brief introduction and welcome to us today. Thank you for being here, Dean Davis, and we really appreciate you welcoming us and starting us off here.
Well, you have to put up with me. I have a little bit of a cold. That last student who sneezed on me just really did it. But I'd like to start by thanking Billy and Michael for really working on this event. It's really exciting to be here and also welcome you to USF and 101 Howard. This particular event, and I'm excited because we get to really talk about innovation, entrepreneurship in cities, and really about building an economically prosperous, sustainable, and just city for the future. Today, we get an opportunity to really focus on the advent of autonomous vehicles, both the opportunities and the challenges, and then really talk about how we can plan and co-create the future here. There are very, very few cities that are really planning for this kind of innovation and more, and this is where we believe USF can really be a bridge. Research would indicate that only 2 of the 25th largest metropolitan areas really even mention autonomous or connected vehicles in their planning documents. So today's event is really designed as a series of panels to really dialogue the impacts and the policy implications. Our goal, and Billy and Michael have been working on this for quite a while, our goal is to really develop a very tacit policy and some management recommendations that can have impact, particularly in the areas of land use, social and economic implications of this kind of technology. So I welcome all of you again to USF and the School of Management. And onward, I'll turn this back to Billy. Thank you.
Nice. All right. Thank you, Dean Davis. So in terms of our organization today, we're going to have 3 panels. And before each panel, we're going to have a brief audience survey. One of those surveys, as well as a check-in, is up on your Holistic app right now. So if you want to engage in that first survey, we invite you to do that. It's called the AV City Introductory Survey. And as you do that, we're going to invite one of our key sponsors from Arup, Will Baumgardner and Melissa Rule up. And what we're going to do is we're going to try to set the stage and at least provide an overview. And you can come on up. We're going to provide an overview of where we're going for the next few hours. And again, our hope is this sets the menu for us to have a more robust dialogue with our panelists. And as a result, we'll be able to really leave with some tacit policies and some ideas that really can be implemented today, next week, and this year to impact us going forward. So let me just start off with saying, like, we're gonna be pretty rigid on our time frame. This is gonna take. We're gonna start off right away, and at 2 o'clock we're gonna go right into our first panel. We will take pretty quick and snappy breaks. We will have some refreshments in the back. We invite you to step out and engage in those. But we're gonna start right back up on the hour and keep things going so that we can cover a lot today. So with all that said, let me just turn it over to Melissa and to Will.
Thank you very much, Billy, and to the organizers. It's really great to be part of this event at Arup as planners and designers and consultants in kind of all aspects of of cities and the built environment. This is just an absolutely critical topic for us, and an exciting one that we're spending a lot of energy on with our clients, helping them prepare for this future. I guess I want to thank Billy for giving us about 15 minutes to cover one of the most transformational technologies of our generation. So we're going to fly at a pretty high level, but we want to kind of circle around to, what do we know now, and what don't we know, and what can we do in the near term. This is a really interesting, fascinating time to be an urban planner, a transportation planner. I'm about 20 years into a transportation planning career, and the pace of change during that career has been glacial. The car, things take a long time to get done. I'm looking at the second half of my career and seeing the pace of change just completely different, transformational potentially. And it's just particularly exciting to be in this field right now. So, we all have been. A lot of us are planners here. We've spent a lot of our careers trying to get people out of their cars, trying to reduce the negative impacts of personal car travel on our cities and our communities, and we've made pretty great progress in that area in a number of ways. The point that we are now is kind of this inflection point, though, and this level of uncertainty that we haven't had to deal with before. And if you've read about this topic and you look into this topic, there's a lot of heaven and hell scenarios, and there's a lot of truth in those. You can make a reasonable case for either of the outcomes. And this is where policy intervention and smart planning and preparation and proactive work by all the people in this room comes in to make sure that we get the outcome that we want. So it's a tremendous opportunity that's created with autonomous vehicles and intelligent mobility generally, in terms of the ability to use the system more efficiently, to think about how we use land use differently, particularly the parking question, safety, and even public transportation and shared transportation, and the new opportunities that we potentially have to deliver better quality service to more people at lower cost. At the same time, there are these tremendous risks. All the signs point to increased driving. That's one of the few things that we are pretty confident in. There's a tremendous amount of uncertainty in this field, and it's really stressing our ability to do long-range transportation planning, long-range planning. It's becoming much more like a risk analysis exercise, and we're changing the way that we're thinking about this. But some things are very, very variable, and uncertain. But the fact that more people will probably be driving is one that we're reasonably confident in. Empty vehicle circulation, more access to mobility, lower cost of the time penalty of driving because you can be doing something else. All of those signs point to more driving. And that could encourage sprawl, obvious questions about security and privacy, and doomsday scenarios around that. And then, real concerns about equity as transportation moves into more of a public-private realm. And I think everybody's here because you recognize that the stakes are quite high and extremely broad-reaching to virtually all aspects of our city. So, one of the big questions is when. and how fast. And what we do know is it's going to be a transition period. It's not going to be all or nothing. It could happen pretty quickly, or it could be much more drawn out. It certainly will be different in different places, and so there aren't any one-size-fits-all strategies. There's going to be certain strategies that are going to be effective across the board, but they're going to be needed at different times. We've been looking at it, and in the conversations that we've had with a lot of experts, we've been trying to frame this as there's two pathways. There's an evolutionary and a revolutionary pathway. You can kind of make the case for either one, but at least that provides us with a little bit of a frame of reference. But ultimately, we're still looking at having a mix of autonomous and legacy-driven vehicles for quite a long period of time. And so we can dream about the fully autonomous future, and I'm sure we'll get there at some point.
A seamless app where not only can you get on your train with this app, but you can also get your bike share. You can maybe even call a TNC. You can have a full suite of mobility that is through the regulator, through the different systems of financing that may provide subsidy across the board. And it's not this system where the haves have a certain suite of access and the have-nots have a much more limited suite. And that's no small task. There are a lot of different services. There are a lot of different brands. They're rising. They're falling. They're becoming bigger than the expectations were ever initially had about them. They're completely falling as soon as the expectations get reasonably high. It's a pretty wild world out there, and trying to understand what it is and how the public is involved is a critical question for today. And the final area that we think action can be taken today is around redesigning streets. And in order to talk about this, I'm going to talk about a project that ARIP did with Perkins and Will. Jerry Tierney there is in the audience. We did over the past year on a street in San Francisco, 4th Street. So we took these three scenarios and we tried to understand how it could change the street. So if you have the revolutionary scenario, what would that mean for the street? How many more bicycles would there be? What would traffic volume be like? Would parking demand change? Would curb demand change? And we took the real plans for increased zoning, the real plans for increased buildings, the street of the future, as far as volume, as far as everything, and tried to understand how these scenarios interact in them. And we found, of course, that parking demand plummets in the revolutionary scenario, but it stays actually pretty high still in the evolutionary scenario. Curb demand skyrockets in the evolutionary scenario. Everyone needs to be serviced at the curb. And by curb demand, I mean people who need to get picked up or dropped off at the curb. We did not include logistics and goods in this study. At the same time, that curb demand increased also in the evolutionary scenario. So that meant that in the evolutionary scenario, you see the curb explode with high parking and high curb demand. Whereas in the evolutionary scenario, you see curb demand alone becoming prominent. Which means that we can design our streets much differently in the revolutionary scenario. So this is 4th Street, the street we studied in San Francisco, just down here a little bit by Moscone Center. So it's a pretty auto-oriented road with 4 lanes, one way, the whole kit and caboodle. And in our study, we were able to reduce from 4 to 2 lanes. We added a lot of pedestrian infrastructure and landscaping, and we ended a 2-way cycle track. And we took away all the on-street parking. We had some loading zones. But this is a street I think a lot of us want to see. I mean, actually, we can start designing it today. So that's our kind of our key takeaway, and I think all of the panels are going to touch on it today. So many of the actions to build the city we want tomorrow, we can do today, and I think the will is higher than it ever has been, not just in anticipation of these disruptions on our horizon, but in visualizing this future we want. So thank you, and over to Billy.
All right. So thank you both. That was a really good way to start. So I'm going to keep us on task. We have two reminders here. Is one, we do have this participatory app, and we're going to toggle to see some of our preliminary survey results. And only 25 of you, or maybe around 30 now, have chosen to participate thus far. But really, we want to make this as participatory as possible. 3 things we can do here. Hold on a second, Gabe. If we could just remind us to download. And then click on, you'll get a series of screens that look just about like this. We've got a new survey broadcasting right now that'll be for our first panel, which we're going to start promptly in about 4 minutes. Before we do that, I just want to make sure that people are aware that our sponsors today, we have a very good suite of sponsors. I just want to thank Arup, who you've heard from, San Jose State and the Manetta Transportation Institute were critical. Cal Poly, Elistic, who you've heard from. We got sponsorship from Planetizen, who will be hosting the Refined video after we're done here today, as well as the American Planning Association. We have some material from them over here on this side of the room. Check it out during the breaks. We're going to take about 3 or 4 minutes now. Download the app. I'd like my panelists to come up here for our first session. We're going to keep it snappy. And while we're doing that, there's going to be another survey. So take some time and tell us what you think. So here's the results of what we first found. Apparently everyone thinks that there's going to be quite an impact from autonomous vehicles. And no surprise here, you seem to be a little bit of a self-selected audience. But let's see how that progresses as we go forward today.
My name is Nico Larco. I'm a professor in architecture and urban design at the University of Oregon. I'm co-director of the Sustainable Cities Initiative, and I help run something called the Urbanism Next research initiative that we've been working on for the last 2 years, which looks at not only AVs, but also e-commerce and the sharing economy and the secondary impacts of these things. So very much in line with all of this. I want to start off by thanking Billy and Mike for organizing, being the leads in organizing this, USF for hosting us here, and the panel obviously for taking the time to be part of this thing. So just so the panel can get a little bit of a sense. How many people here are from the public sector? From the private sector? How many people are from academia? That's a great mix. How many people are designers? Planners? Engineer types? Am I missing out major categories? I think those are the main categories, right? Psychologists? Do we have any psychologists in the room? Thank you. Okay, great. The panel that we're looking at right now is on land use and what kind of changes are going to be happening in land use. I think from the presentation we saw before and from the things that we've all been reading, change is coming, absolutely. AVs are absolutely going to be here. In a phrase that I use all the time that Jerry Tierney has taught me, this has gone from science fiction to science fact, and this is real and happening, and we need to figure out what to do. A line that we like to say all the time is that AVs are not a transportation issue. AVs are an everything issue. They are going to affect a ton of our cities and our lives. Everything, land use, equity, land valuation, sprawl, street design, labor, you name it. And I think it's an important message that we get out. And I think this conference is more or less structured around this idea so that, one, it's not a bunch of transportation people talking to each other, so that we expand the number of people who are looking at these topics, and two, so that we get people involved. So we get people in housing involved, people who are interested in equity concerns, all these different pieces involved. So what we wanted to look at in land use is two main things. There's positive and negative aspects that are going to be happening to land use based on AV kind of technologies and TNCs. And we want to talk a little bit about the disruption, first of all, of what's going to happen. And then in each one of these questions, how to prepare for those things. I think the whole panel has, and I hope everyone has in their heads that these changes that are going to be happening, the way that we deal with them as cities, as agencies, as private sector companies is, first and foremost, what do we want our communities to be? And then we figure out how to leverage these technologies to do those things. And we're not just here to accommodate autonomous vehicles. We're here to figure out what we want our cities to be and how we leverage those things. So the four topics that we're going to be dealing with today, after a discussion that we had on what we should focus on, we're going to talk about sprawl, parking, freight-induced changes based on these technologies, and street and district design. And so with that, I will introduce our panel. So we have all the way on the end, Pierre Maillot, who's a senior technology advisor for the Bosch Groups. He's worked in smart community development in San Francisco. He's one of the leader pioneers of the Bosch Smart Cities Initiative and has had several management positions all over the world, Europe, Asia, North America. We have Jeremy Madsen over here. Sorry, this is the list, the order that I've written them down. He's the CEO of the Greenbelt Alliance, which I think everyone here knows in the Bay Area, doing a lot of work in policy and advocacy. He was a Green Alliance field director for Washington State's Transportation Choices Coalition, and he's a graduate of the University of Oregon. So we should have a special warm place in our hearts for that. Cynthia Kroll, right here on my left, is the Chief Economist and Assistant Director of Integrated Planning and Research for ABAG and the MTC, oversees economic development and forecasting, and so she's responsible for the regional forecast that I know everyone in the Bay Area uses tremendously. Has been at the Fisher Center for Real Estate and Urban Economics at Berkeley, California Office of Economics, Policy, Planning, and Research, and at SRA International. Michael Johnson, in the middle there, is from the Smith Group out of Detroit. He's an urban design. He's the urban design practicing director. Has worked on a range of catalytic landscape architecture urban design projects. Has worked for many Fortune 500 companies, a lot of large universities, and he serves on the board of a fantastic organization. If you don't know it, the Landscape Architecture Foundation just does great work. And then Tilly Chang. Second one in over there, is the executive director of the San Francisco County Transportation Authority, works a lot with public and private sector on transportation options for the entire area, has worked at the World Bank and at the MTC and Spur and UC Connect. So we're thrilled to have the whole panel here. Thank you very much for taking the time. So my first question is, many have argued that autonomous vehicles are going to have a lot of unintended consequences. We like to call those secondary impacts, and that they're going to be increasing pressure on sprawl. So what do you think about that? How is that going to happen? Why is it going to happen? What are these secondary impacts of this push going to be? And what can we do about this? And part of the what can we do about this, is this any different than the kind of smart growth strategies that we've all thought are near and dear to our hearts? Is this different than that? And so I'm going to start with Tilly on that question. You have to.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Nico. Is this on? Hi. So thank you, first of all, Nico and USF, for having all of us and convening this panel and this whole workshop. It's a very big topic, and I think cities around the world, everyone really is engaged. We're seeing change that has accelerated beyond anything we've seen in at least my professional lifetime, and I think all of us are grappling with this question. However, there is becoming a body of research and public opinion that, yes, for cities, and I want to make a point that cities are not monolithic. My perspective of cities is from the standpoint of a dense urban city in a metropolitan region. Really, we are concerned. We are concerned that the benefits of AVs, which are certainly in the area of safety and in terms of accessibility for those who are unable to drive, and those who and land use benefits of, say, perhaps less provision of parking, that those may be overshadowed by the vast reduction in cost, the massive increase in convenience and ease and convenience and attractiveness of driving in an AV environment. And so for that reason, we've been tracking research from around the world, including at UC Davis, that has talked about the potential for huge amounts of induced demand in VMT. And I know that other experts on the panel will talk about that as well. And so we want to get ahead of this. In fact, we're tracking sort of as AV 1.0, the TNC phenomenon, which has benefits as well, widespread benefits, but also has the potential to induce traffic. We're seeing research coming, again, out of, I think, UC Davis, that released a recent study on 7 major cities that documented that there has been quite a bit of induced demand, as well as mode shift impacts on the sort of sustainable modes, walking, biking, and transit. And that is of great concern, I think, to all of us. It's a 4-year-long study of 7 major cities. And so this research is just emerging, and I really want to sort of call for even more research collaborations and funding of research at all levels of government, because things like this can really help us understand what's happening. There's also some, I think, finding about whether there's a reduction in automobile ownership, and that's going to be really transformative for cities if that can be accomplished. But if it can't be accomplished, and we really are just left with a lot more driving and demand, then things like our long-time transit first policy are really at risk.
So let me pass it over. So because of the limited time, we're not going to have everyone speak about everything. So I'm going to have Jeremy talk, because a lot of the work that you do in your organization has to do with sprawl and expansion of the metropolitan footprint. What are your thoughts on this?
So, first thought, let's think about these different visions. So some call them dystopian, utopian. Walking my kid to school today, I live in the city of Alameda, which is just across the water, essentially a first-tier suburb. And I was just looking at all the parking spaces and thinking about something I read recently that said, maybe in the AV future we have 90% less parking. And we're going to talk more about parking later, so I won't go too deep into that. But think about all that space that we now have within our existing cities and towns to create the places we want to have, to accommodate new development. And therefore, maybe the sprawl pressure is reduced. Conversely, I think everything that Tilly just said in terms of the induced driving that could occur. I was reading a piece that was thinking about marketing for the future for AVs, offices on wheels, bedrooms on wheels. Commuter sex could be like a future marketing ploy for getting people into AVs. And so some might consider that actually maybe that's the utopian vision, but the opportunity for the commute to no longer be the impediment to living in a far-flung place goes down. So what does that mean in terms of these secondary impacts? I look at this through the implications for our regional landscape, and I work on the Greenbelt Alliance. 3.6 million acres surrounding our 800,000 acres of cities and towns in this region. I think about that increasingly, especially in an era of climate change and just an uncertain future, as green infrastructure. This is going to be a source of, with the droughts and water uncertainty going forward, we're going to have to take care of our water resources or have more water resources coming from local sources. A lot of that is greenbelt land that could be lost if we start to see sprawl go up because we've moved into a future with AVs that facilitate sprawl. So what do I think that means in terms of policy? Where do we go next? I think it's been said several times, so I'll say it actually relatively quickly here. We have to plan. This is an era. This is the golden era for planners coming up. Because if we allow for the technology and what's coming to just happen to us, I think we will see some of this dystopian future come about. If we really think proactively, we have a chance to have a better future. And so just pick up on something Nico said there briefly, and maybe provocative in this room. I'm not really interested in planning for AVs. I'm interested in planning for how do we deal with the affordable housing crisis? How do we deal with the mobility crisis? How do we accommodate values we have here in the San Francisco Bay Area around resource protection and climate sustainability and social equity? I think AVs can be a tool in that, or could be part of the challenge. I'd like to make them the tool through good thinking and good planning.
Great, thank you.
Actually, Nico, could I just
sure.
One last thought on that in terms of what can we do? I completely agree with that idea. That really, in many ways, it's super disruptive. The biggest change we've seen in our lifetimes, and professionally, perhaps. But in many ways, we don't need to deviate and shouldn't deviate from our strategies as cities. San Francisco has had the benefit of a 40-year-long transit-first policy. It's very durable. It has served us well. It will continue to serve us well, even in this new landscape. And in fact, we're doubling down on that. We're developing a policy framework together with our sister agency, SFMTA, bringing it to the public, bringing it to the board, just confirming that these are the things that we care about, and running every single technology and new service through those lenses, and then really making sure that we're prioritizing the high capacity, publicly accessible public transportation, biking, walking, and those networks. So right-of-way prioritization, number one, which has always been part of our strategy, is even more important in this context, as well as potentially getting the prices right, incentives and prices right, to get better occupancy and throughput.
Great. So let me ask Cynthia your perspective on this, and also I'll push again on the question of, and Tilly kind of mentioned it a little bit right now, in terms of the questions on pressures on sprawl, should we just keep doing what we've been doing in terms of smart growth, or are there other things we need to be thinking about?
So we come to this from really a regional perspective, and And I want to emphasize that there's a lot to be done. How this affects San Francisco is very different than how it affects a suburban area or an exurban area in the Bay Area. And so we really need to recognize that. I think we also need to look at how it affects different populations. I mean, one of the things I do in the regional forecast is look at the changing demographics and the graying of the population throughout the country, and in particular parts of the Bay Area, and particularly in the suburban parts of the Bay Area. And so this is an age group that more and more over time has to step back from driving. This may allow a lot more cars on the road in those areas than would be there otherwise. It will make them safer cars. But also it changes the living dynamic in that you can stay in your home in a suburban area longer if a machine is doing the driving for you instead of yourself. The other point I want to make is that most of the built environment is there already, and that really came through in Tilly's description of how San Francisco is looking at this. San Francisco is not changing how it's being built because of this. It's focusing really on the management of it. So where's the building going to happen? Some of it will be infill and opportunities if parking is freed up, although I need to understand more about just how that happens, because you have to put those cars someplace. But a big question we have to face, and which you've really brought up, is what does smart growth mean in the less urban areas? And there I think we do have to, I agree entirely with Jeremy that the focus needs to be on what do you want to preserve out there? How important is your green space to you? And I just want to mention as well that when I was invited to be on this panel, I said, autonomous vehicles, we have a whole transportation side, and a number of whom are represented here, who are really thinking about that in detail and how we should apply it to the next plan, because we really didn't to this plan. But they insisted they wanted a land use economist perspective, so that's what you got.
Great. And as I said, I think it's important to cover all these areas. And I'll say as well, so we heard a lot about kind of the effects in an area like San Francisco, which is growing like crazy. One thing that Ben Clark from University of Oregon mentions all the time is, how does this affect places like Cleveland, which is not growing? What happens when you have all of a sudden like all this additional land available and you're in a place that's not growing? I think it's something we have to think about as well. So in the interest of time, I'm going to move to our second topic, which is parking, which I think we all love thinking about. I always tell my students in urban design that form does not follow function, form follows parking all the time. So this is a huge revolution, a huge opportunity for us. So parking needs seem to be a key change in the AV and TNC future. I think that many people have been talking about that. So what kind of changes do you think we're going to be seeing in parking need and utilization? What do you think are the most critical secondary impacts of that, both positive and negative? And what should we do? And I'm talking when the we here being cities, citizens, developers, residents, to prepare for this. And I'm going to go ahead and start with Pierre for this one.
Hello, good afternoon. So I'm working with Bosch, with a private company. I'm not selling appliances. Bosch is the largest automotive supplier in the world. We are working with a lot of set of sensors and software to provide driving assistance technology. And obviously one of the biggest activity we have now is around autonomous driving. So my idea is more to provide a perspective from a technology standpoint. As far as parking is concerned, today we see already technology on street parking where we are using sensor on the ground, or like the SF Park initiative where you know that a parking spot is occupied. As a driver, you know that where you can drive, and as a city, you know where you have to actually send your agent to put the fines. Now, moving on to the autonomous driving technology, this will require a lot of sensors and radars around the car to, see where are positioned all the other cars, control your speed and everything. And one of the solutions that we see will be also changing the way we are looking at parking is what we call community-based parking. So the car, when you drive on street, will be able to detect if there is an open parking spot while you are driving. You don't need to actively notify it. The car will notify it directly. And then there will be a pool of users which will then benefit from this information and then direct themselves where they can park. Parking is responsible for 30% of the traffic in the urban environment, so that will be hopefully also helping in solving traffic. Moving forward to the next step, like fully autonomous driving, it's obviously you see all these cars on the street with Uber testing it, Waymo and everything, but legislation will take some time because before it can actually be implemented. However, in underground parking garage, we believe that there will be earlier adoption because it's a confined private area. And we already implemented a demo solution of what we called automated valet parking, where basically you can just drop the car at a drop-off zone in a parking area, and then the car will go and park by itself. The car has autonomous driving technology. It will communicate with the infrastructure of the parking garage, and we actually demoed it. It worked in one of the, it's actually the parking garage of the Mercedes-Benz Museum in Stuttgart. So that's autonomous valet parking technology, because then the car go and park by itself. You don't need to open the door anymore. It will then increase the efficiency of the usage of the overall parking structure. And moving forward, when you are planning your parking in 5-10 years from now, then for the same space, you can put more parking spots. Or for the same number of parking spots, you can use less space. So for developer, for cities, you can use this land for something which will be much more interesting, valuable, housing, stuff like that. So that is a positive impact of autonomous driving. I will conclude with saying now we are working with developers, and one of the ideas also this new trend of using transportation as a service, less ownership into cars, will also require less parking structure. Right? You don't need a car to be parked, you will be dropped up and everything. So when we look at planning for new urban development, we obviously reduce the parking structure.
Great. So I'm going to pass it over then to Michael, coming from the design side. What kind of impacts do you see with this?
Yeah, and I actually, to go back to kind of where we started with the folks from Europe, I mean, I think I'm really intrigued by this idea of evolutionary versus revolutionary. I think the one aspect of that we have the responsibility to really be revolutionary in is from a parking policy perspective. These are things that we can change immediately and need to change. The things that maybe even using the autonomous vehicle is a little bit of a bait for that conversation to begin to happen. I mean, I think in many of our cities across the country and across the world, we're already overparked and need to kind of realize the real value of urban land and suburban land and other things like that. I'm really interested in how the technology is working today and will work in the future to use less and less space to park our cars as we think about using these assets more throughout the day rather than just kind of leaving them somewhere. From a design perspective, I think I'm really interested in the disconnection of parking then from the uses of the buildings and what that may allow in cities like San Francisco, in cities like Buffalo, New York, which just adopted a zero parking minimum. I mean, Buffalo can do it, right, as a policy today. Detroit, we're looking to advance some of those things. So, I think that's really, really exciting to me because I think it allows us to reevaluate the highest and best use of urban land, of suburban land, and really break our thinking about the way that we've traditionally thought about planned environments. As a parking first. This doesn't need to be an afterthought. It can't be an afterthought. We need to lead with policy that changes it now.
Yeah, as a designer, I have to say, like the idea of being able to not deal with parking. I mean, the feasibility of projects, the scale of projects goes through the roof. And we just started doing research on the land valuation impacts when you all of a sudden have this increased supply available, which on the one hand is going to be fantastic for affordable housing, and then for people who own buildings might be kind of painful. There's a whole lot of our value of properties is wrapped up in land. So in the interest of time, we're going to move on. So the next topic we really want to look at is this question of freight. Freight is probably going to be one of the first things that gets automated. And we're seeing the change that's happening already with e-commerce and warehousing that's happening in cities. And so I'm curious to hear people's thoughts on how it is that how these freight-induced changes are going to be happening throughout the city, and what we should be preparing for with that. And I'm going to start the question off with Cynthia.
Okay. So the typical pattern of what's happening with freight in an area like ours is that as land gets more and more expensive in the central city, the distribution activities first move out to the inner ring of the suburbs, so areas like 880, and then they move out beyond 880 to the areas like Solano County, and then eventually move out beyond the region entirely to the next region. And so you get distribution happening from further and further away, larger and larger warehouses being built up in the outer area. And a lot of that is shaped by the human costs of the driving. I mean, that's a big piece of the total cost of distribution. As you shift to a more automated process of doing this, I think there are a lot of options that may well affect where that distribution happens then. And there are side effects in terms of employment and loss of jobs, but many of those jobs are already becoming less well-paying than they were historically. So, for example, one could see autonomous vehicles being used in a much broader variety of scales so that you can get to this just-in-time delivery. I mean, right now, you can get just-in-time delivery from Amazon within a couple of hours. A guy with a radio playing drives up to your house and drops it off. So one can imagine autonomous vehicles playing, of all sizes, playing a much more varied role. And I don't really know yet what the effects will be on land use demand, what the effects will be on what's now a consolidation of this activity at the periphery. But hopefully that could lead to overall less VMT in delivery on the optimistic side.
Let me pass it on to Tilly. What are your thoughts about these?
My best. I'm not that up on all the freight. I know that there's the long distance freight benefits that people expect in safety, in terms of driver fatigue, in terms of platooning and fuel economy and efficiency. In the city environment, I think goods movement defaults to a curb management question for deliveries, and the curb being that premium space that really requires that, a really smart, focused policy look. And so this delivery question and how and where we allow freight and goods movement deliveries to happen, and whether they should actually be prioritized on things like our sidewalks, where we're starting to see robot delivery technologies available. And we had a policy discussion at the Board of Supervisors in San Francisco recently about that. So it's very early, and I think we're all trying to better understand the landscape, as well as the benefits and the potential impacts. But just yesterday, Mayor Lee called for a pilot of TNCs on the curb, and that's both for passenger and I think for goods delivery markets as well. So I think we'll need to monitor that, and it does come down to having a very strong prioritization framework, I think, for curbside management.
Yeah, the curbside management, I think, will be a huge issue. If people haven't seen it, NACTO just came out last week with their blueprint for autonomous vehicles, and they have some really interesting ideas for curbside management, including that we could easily just time to limit things, right? So certain times are for freight, certain times are for people. Deliveries are going to be, as the picking up and dropping off people will be as challenging as the picking up and dropping off my roll of toothpaste, or my tube of toothpaste that's for some reason I order and I get just one box with that. Not that I do that, but I've heard people do that. Same thing with some of the comments you'd made. Yeah, the size of warehousing is completely changing the whole function. Amazon right now is doing 1.4 to 1.6 million square feet buildings for distribution, which, for those of you who know Portland, that's 21 of our this is this huge shift that's happening. So the last question we want to get to gets really more to the design side of this, and curbside is definitely one of the issues that we can pick up in this. So as is repeatedly come up, and the presentation that was done before by Arup talks something about this, there's going to be changes to both street design and district design. So I was wondering if you could paint us a picture, and I'm going to start with you, Michael. If you could paint us a picture of how a street or a district might look like in a Navy future. What kind of differences are we going to see on the ground? What challenges and opportunities does this provide, and how should we prepare for these things?
Well, I think, first we need to frame a little bit what streets are. and what we want to achieve out of streets. I mean, for forever and ever, the streets in our country and in many countries have been places to move vehicles first, designed from the center line out. And I think this provides a real opportunity for us to think about the real estate and the kind of public asset that streets provide in our cities, in our suburbs, and kind of all the places in between. Thinking about it not from and you use the word design, but to me this is a really holistic design. This is not something that designers need to do in a vacuum. We need to think about this from an economic value, from a health perspective, from all kinds of different folks need to get together and really demand what do we need to get out of our streets. I think there's environmental aspects to this that when you think about how much space in a city is taken up by streets, taken up by parking, I think that we can gain some real environmental benefits, some real health benefits by really changing the way that we think about streets. If we really put the individual at the center and social determinants of health and the kind of what are the things that we can achieve as design professionals and planners in streets that we can't do now. And again, a lot of this and many of what the introduction said is that you have to start with a human first perspective on that. Let's put the pedestrian first. Let's put the bicycle first, and then let's allow this new flexibility to think about how we use this real estate differently, because it's huge, it's massive, and it's different in each of our cities, right? The real estate in San Francisco is different. The street real estate is different than the street real estate in D.C. is different than Detroit, where it was a city built on the automobile and is way overscaled. And so how can we put in the perspective of Detroit, Michigan, can we become the first food city that produces all of its food for its residents and within some of these public right-of-ways and different things like that. I mean, I think it's a really fascinating conversation, and it plays to all scales, but it really requires us all to look together, to do some of the provocative things that Arup and Perkins and Will were doing at the kind of block level. But let's think about this at the city level too, because I think all streets shouldn't be all things for all people and all modes. So how do we make sure that we put that in the forefront of our minds too, as we think about the nuanced differences between?
So I'll point to the policy side of it as like prioritizing which kinds of modes, which I think there's been a lot of great work happening. A lot of it on the West Coast, I have to say. Yes. Tilly, you had something you wanted to add real quick?
If I could just add on this question of design, and I'm just going to borrow and paraphrase from Malcolm Doherty, director of Caltrans, who spoke last week at a panel at Focus about AV technology and how, when will we be able to, for example, realize the benefits of this idea of, platoon vehicles who just, basically effectively increase the capacity of each lane from, say, 800 vehicles per hour per lane on an arterial to double that, or 2,000 vehicles per hour per lane on a freeway and double that. So this is the dream. This is to some degree, the hope and the hype. We hope that we can realize those reliability and safety benefits and throughput benefits, but for a long time, we're going to have a mixed fleet. The transition is not going to be as rapid as many people maybe perhaps expect. We believe that you're going to see private vehicles here and there have pilots, shuttles. He believes, and I believe as well, are going to be some of the first things that cities will want to experiment with, shared vehicle applications, microtransit, whatnot. But eventually, when we get there, it's going to need to happen in stages. And I think the question is, how quickly will that adoption happen? And we've seen in motorization, it's always the early adopters, the more affluent segments of the community. And so how do we make sure that everyone can actually move toward that future? And as well, when can we start then assuming these new sort of capacities in our design work? And I think it'll be a bit longer than we may expect.
Absolutely. The transition time is going to be a big question. Pierre, do you want to tell us your thoughts about this? So street design, district design?
Yeah, so basically I also wanted to highlight what Tilly just mentioned, that we saw that from the different scenarios, but there will be definitely a mixed use of vehicle between autonomous and traditional for the next 20, 30 years. And that means that from a technology standpoint, autonomous vehicle have to comply with the existing street design and urban environment. That being said, when new communities are being developed, it doesn't mean that we cannot make them a little bit more autonomous driving friendly. And what we are doing now, we are working with a master developer of 5 Point, who is looking at large community scale developments, both in San Francisco but also in the Concord East Bay. And we are looking at how technology, autonomous driving technology, might impact the street design. And what we see that we would potentially recommend the use of dedicated lane, because we believe that the first adoption of autonomous driving would be for shuttle, bus, street cleaning vehicle, where having a dedicated lane will obviously increase traffic, but also occupancy, as we all would like see this to happen. Also fostering so-called smart infrastructure, where we have the infrastructure communicated with the vehicle, will increase not only safety, but also traffic, with improving the traffic flow. Potentially this dedicated lane for autonomous driving might even be also narrower, because you have a much better control of your driving skills. That will then give space for the sidewalk, and back again to what Michael mentioned regarding giving back the city to the pedestrian, to the bicycle, and then ultimately, yes, in the very, very long-term future, when the whole fleet is being automated, then you might not even need for intersection. You might not even need for all of that. But that's still a long way to go. Nevertheless, we see a benefit in working now at the early stage with developer, with city planner, from a technology standpoint, to make sure that when you develop a community or a new city from scratch, then you can make them a little bit more autonomous, driving friendly, and prepare for the future.
Right. So, Jeremy, I'm going to have you, if you could talk a little bit about what you see some of the changes might be, land use-based changes in the street design and also district design. I'm going to maybe nudge a little bit to say, and what kind of changes do you see differentiating between suburban areas and more urban areas? Might be an interesting thing.
There we go. So, a few thoughts on that. So first of all, I just want to emphasize what some of the other folks have said, which is I think there's a real opportunity, but also a real risk here of opportunity to plan for people in terms of district and the street itself. But there's a real opportunity to go the wrong way. And let's not lose sight of that. I mean, we've all probably experienced, some of us just today, that walking across 4 lanes of traffic, getting to an island, and trying to get across to waiting, for a horrible time, waiting for 2 left turn lanes to go, then trying to get across that. And I don't know what the autonomous vehicle version of that, but there is an opportunity for us, a threat of us planning for, planning for the vehicle versus people, and that just should be the kind of a driving factor. In terms of, difference between suburbia and urban areas, I think one of the things is obviously there's going to continue to be a differentiation between San Francisco and a place like Concord. However, I think we all know about this idea of, the urbanization of suburbia, and that people increasingly are saying, I want to have, kind of an interesting community that I can live in with my home and shops and other amenities nearby. And so I think that as we see change coming forward, some brought about by AVs, some facilitated by AVs, but also some just facilitated by kind of the evolution of communities. That's going to be happening. So everybody has a place they can be proud to call home. Maybe if I can take 10 more seconds here, which is maybe to close us out here. But as I was kind of preparing for this, I ran across this quote from Konstantin Samaros, who's at Carnegie Mellon in environmental engineering and civil engineering. And it was really fascinating to see it, because he said, my whole career, people have been saying, we wish we could know, or we've been saying, we wish we could have known the social cost of driving, or we would have done things differently. And he says, policymakers today have to think about this now, because the decisions that we make today affect the landscape for a century. And I think that's really true. It goes back a little bit to what Cynthia was talking about earlier. We have Plan Bay Area here in the region. goes out through 2040, really didn't think a whole lot about AVs. This time around, there's going to be another version of it in 4 years. But I think the changes that are going to happen in the future, we have to be thinking about now, or else we risk some of the dystopian outcomes that we're all worried about.
Great. That actually ties in well to a question that I'm going to ask now, but I'm going to have you answer in a little bit. So as I ask this, we're going to open up for questions from the audience. So think about what you want to ask. But after we get questions from the audience, I want to do like a speed round where you get like 2 or 3 sentences to say, if there's one thing that cities should be paying attention to right now, policy-wise, what's the thing that they should be doing? Or agencies. You can decide what your geography is. But you can think about that while we open it up for questions from the audience. Billy, you can see I'm on time. I can't believe this. Over there. And do we have a mic for that? You're going to steal one of our mics? And please say who you are and where you're coming from.
Hi, my name's Stacy Vandecker Bartlett, and I'm a strategy consultant with Ellison Associates. And my question, I'll direct it towards Tilly, but would be happy to take answers from everyone. I'm intentionally pushing the envelope. What would stop us from here in San Francisco, since we have our unique geographic area, our forward-leaning tendencies, our progressive nature, from saying 2025, that's it. No more cars unless they're autonomous. No more human driving. That gets our Vision Zero happening. Why couldn't we do that?
That's very provocative, and I think we could. I mean, I think we're starting to see mayors around the world and communities really express that we really want to enhance livability, safety. And so the question is, what is the carrying capacity of a city in terms of motorization? And that's an age-old question that predates AV. And hopefully in the future it's AV, EV. It's one and the same. Phil Ting has called for us to, to basically phase out traditional combustion engines as a state, like other communities and states and countries have done, and we expect China's about to join the League of Nations that have done this. So yes, I think we can express that. I think it has to be a community-wide conversation and an inclusive conversation, because these are big changes. A lot of people, don't prefer to be auto-dependent, but they are, because we are not able to provide the transit accessibility and the walkable communities and the land use, sort of options that people need to have, to be able to abandon their vehicles, and especially in a 7x7 city, there are places in our city that are very auto-dependent, and we have not. So I think that the whole strategy has to hang together. So if we're going to have a goal like that, we've talked about trip cap, a VMT cap, which heretofore you've seen places like Stanford or cities like Menlo Park with Facebook. And we're talking about that as a sort of a overarching principle for our countywide transportation plan for 2040 to 2050. So exactly, in the sort of the spirit of what you're suggesting is the conversation that we're trying to have, and it may manifest in terms of, whether it's VMT, climate inequity is really sort of what we're really focused on, and so vehicles and vehicle policies will figure prominently. Now, who can predict whether car shedding will actually happen, or whether we will see this huge divide between the rich and the poor? So I think we really need to be careful and thoughtful about such a policy, because it's a great goal, but how do we get there, and what are all the other pieces that need to happen in order to make sure that everyone gets there together?
Someone else want to talk about that, or any of these? Yeah, I'll say one other thing, which is with the Vision Zero. My sense is that the conversion to AVs might happen faster than we think, not because of people wanting the uptake, but insurance might actually force us in that direction. If it really turns out to be so much safer, you're going to be hard pressed to say, well, I like to drive, but I'm sorry that I've killed your child. I think that might be a quick might accelerate the process. Other questions from the audience? Oh, sorry. Go ahead, please.
And cost for the end user, because with autonomous driving and transportation as a service, the costs of the mobility for the end user will be divided by, we don't know yet, but by 3 to 5. So that will be a huge aspect, a criteria for the adoption of autonomous driving.
And a study just came out that said something like 25% of drivers in the country right now already would save money if they use TNCs instead of having their own vehicle. I mean, that will, our kids that are growing up, I find it hard pressed to find that they will want to put all this capital into this thing they use 5% of the time. Other questions from the audience? Way in the back. Please tell us who you are and where you're coming from.
Yes, most definitely. 1 second. I have to make sure my coffee didn't spill. I think it was empty. Okay, the cup was empty. everything's either half full or empty by me. Yeah, so my name is James Mister. I work for the Bavarian Ministry of Economic Affairs. So Bavaria is home to large automotive companies like Audi and BMW. So my question actually concerns a lot of the messaging that I'm hearing. I actually marked William yesterday on a LinkedIn post where a guy posted that driverless cars will mark the beginning of society's expansion to the exurbs. You know, of course, there are lower operational costs and, you know, a lot of the fringe benefits of having driverless cars, and therefore it will benefit high-income households, apparently. I mean, I'm originally from Chicago, and I've seen a bit, you know, I'm from the outskirts of the city, so, but I've still seen the reverse, you know, I guess, you know, gentrification happening, and then people on, let's say, who are not so able to afford to live in the wealthiest areas to move out of the city. So I'm just really a bit confused about that sort of messaging, that with driverless cars, exurbanization will continue to happen, leaving higher income, you know, households more, you know, with more benefits. Whereas in many cities in America, you have the urban cores that are now being gentrified, and then the outskirts being then more populated by, I mean, less high-income households. But I don't know how this.
Who would like to? Cynthia.
So I think you're underlining something that's really important in this discussion, which is that a lot of what you need to understand is not about the technology, but about how the technology is actually implemented and what the costs are, what the ownership is, for example. If you can use this technology to make it easier to commute, for people to share commuting coming in from these distant areas, then you can lower the transportation costs, but then what will that do to the value of housing in those areas, which is affordable right now to the people who live there? So what will it do overall to the transportation plus housing cost? And I think we don't really know that, partly because we need to flesh out more what this technology is and how it's used. So are we talking about electric vehicles? Are we talking about other kinds of fuel with these vehicles? Are we talking about ownership of these vehicles? Are we talking about shared ownership? And if we're talking about sharing, why does it have to be autonomous vehicles? A lot of that benefit maybe could happen with sharing now. What advantage does having an autonomous vehicle give for sharing? That you don't have to have someone who's willing to drive to 10 different places from Antioch out on the peninsula. Maybe that's the advantage. So I think you've raised some really important questions that need to be filled in before you can really understand the basic one that you asked about. Is this a benefit for people who are wealthy or for people who are living in the exurbs who are not wealthy?
Jeremy.
Just two things. Maybe building a little bit off what Cynthia said there. I think the first thing, just to emphasize what I think has been said over and over and over here, is we have to study, understand the implications for the future on the things we care about. And again, from housing to environment and a whole bunch of things in between, and then make a plan or a whole variety of plans. And I think until we do that, it's a lot of speculation. It's good speculation, but it's speculation. And then the second is just to really kind of bring into the room what I think the question raises that we haven't talked a whole lot about yet. It's been mentioned as a word a few times, but is the equity implications. And I think it's, again, it could be, if designed right, if implemented right, there is the potential for AVs to really be reducing the transportation costs, and thus making kind of life, and especially in a high income, high cost area like the Bay Area, so much better. But if we are not being intentional about that, I can almost guarantee we will go the other direction, where the people at the margins of our society are the ones that are left behind and forgotten, because that happens every time when we don't think about it very intentionally.
Anyone else want to? No? Great. We'll take one more question quickly, and then we're going to do wrap up.
Alan Sarver. I'm retired from a long career in factory automation and logistics planning, and now I'm on a high school board on the peninsula. And I'm finding that as you said, transportation is tied in with housing, is tied in with growth issues, and it's all part of the framework that we really have to be dealing with. And to me, the evolutionary approach really is equivalent to embracing all of the dystopian risks that we've been talking about. And a focus on the revolutionary approach is the way to ensure that we intentionally and carefully begin to reap the benefits of what autonomous vehicles can bring us as a tool toward planning for growth in our future society. So to me, my big focus is what can we be doing in the public sector to bring together the agencies and the leadership to really put that intentionality on the front burner and make sure that we're using this tool to its ultimate revolutionary capabilities to drive everything we do in that direction.
That's like a perfectly teed up to going back to the question I asked originally. So great, thank you. Everyone has 30 seconds, all right? Because or else we'll go over and I'll get yelled at. So 30 seconds to say, what do you think is the most important things that cities should be doing right now on the policy side? Who wants to start? If not, I'll pick someone.
Well, I can start. Maybe not 30 seconds, but I think the important aspect is really to have a cooperative approach between all the different stakeholders. We see too often initiatives which are being driven by one sector, like the industry will do their own pilot and drive around without involving the cities, the public authorities. The public authorities, they will think about what kind of legislation, then the planner, they will say, okay, how, and having everybody into one room to actually address the challenges and doesn't need to be on the city scale, it could be on a district scale where things are being tested, I think is one of the critical aspects here.
Great. Thank you. Tilly?
Okay, in 30 seconds, I think cities need to speak up. I think cities need to have conversations with their communities, really engage everyone in the conversation, educate yourselves, your staff, but also your communities, your grass tops, your grassroots. It's a really complex but very kind of provocative topic, and people want to talk about it. But I think there's a lot of hype, and there's not as much data and research. So demand data, demand research in your public policies and access to your right-of-way, your precious public right-of-way. And cities need to also speak up in the regulatory environment. We're having, we're just giving birth to the regulatory environment for AVs, for TNCs. We're struggling right now with the PUC to have a say here in San Francisco. Those regulations were written years ago, and things have changed drastically, and we're seeing the need to revisit those. At the federal level, there are two pieces of legislation moving through Congress, the House side and the Senate side, that we're a bit concerned about. The NACTO and T for America folks have been talking and weighing in because we think that there's too much potentially preemption of local regulatory authority and enforcement. So we just need to speak up and engage.
Great.
And I would add perhaps lead too. And you went into this a little bit, Tilly, but I think leading with policy, thoughtful policy that begins now. The risk is too great to let the technology lead. I think cities need to begin chipping away with policy that puts the focus on the outcomes that we want from a health perspective, from an environmental perspective, from a human perspective, and start to do these things. It's connected to parking. I think parking is something that we need to start with. The street, the physical design of our streets, things that are very tactile that can have an immediate impact, regardless of how fast we adopt autonomous technologies.
Great, Jeremy.
So great comments from everybody else so far. I would just say three things. One, put people, not vehicles, first. Second, think about the issues that matter, from housing to environment to equity and on. And then third, we need to think about the future now and start working collaboratively, as others have said, to kind of envision the world that is ahead of us versus envisioning the world that is today and thinking that's what's going to be here in 2040 or 2050 or 2060.
Cynthia?
Well, I think Jeremy said it all, along with the comments we had before then. The one other word I want to add to all of this discussion is we've talked a lot about people and drivers in cities, and we haven't talked much about employers. And so one other thing for cities to be thinking about is how this can change not only what works for people, but what works for things like jobs.
Great, thank you. I'll add my one piece, which was echoed by a number of people. It reminded me of this topic. We say a lot, like, one of the things cities need to do more than anything is just pull back the curtain. As soon, like, we don't have to tell everyone in the city departments what each thing they have to be doing, but as soon as you pull back the curtain and show people, like, this is really happening, and let you nudge you on what the ramifications are. The cities that we've worked in, there's a widespread, like, oh my goodness, and then what's the project in front of me and how am I going to change what I do because of that thing? And I think that's an important thing for all cities to be doing. So in wrapping up on time, one, I just want to say how fantastic it is to have a full room here, standing room only, I'll say, for this talk. I mean, it shows how much I think people are really paying attention and we are realizing the things that we need to be working on. I want to say that even though we are not sure really what the outcomes will be, and the Arab study, I think their approach is fantastic in kind of saying, like, we're not sure what these outcomes can be, but we do know today what some of those ramifications might be. So if parking was to do this, these are the things that are going to unfold, right? If we end up having this type of this percentage of shared, this is the types of things that are going to unfold for all these different reasons. And that is work I think that's tremendously important that we do right now. And the conversation today was fantastic in those areas. There is going to be disruption. We need to figure out what those relationships are so we can figure out the policies that we want to make sure that we get to the outcomes that we want. And I think that it was said a number of times, and I love it, to put people first. I want to thank, again, Billy and Mike for putting this together. I want to thank the entire panel for coming. It's fantastic. And I would be remiss if I didn't tell you all that we've got a conference happening in March 5th through 7th in Portland, Urbanism Next Conference, urbanismnext.uoregon.edu, which is going to be a continuation of these conversations. So we hope to see you all there.
All right, so with that, we're going to hear from some of these again. We're going to hear from Nico again at the end, but we're going to take a quick break, really quick, 4 or 5 minutes, and be back here for our next panel. Panelists, if you'd come up, we want to make sure we get you comfortable here on the stage. And remember, we do have a survey, so if you are participating with us, we've got another question primed up for you, and we'll toggle those results for us to start off with our next panel.
Hi, everyone. We're ready to get started, so if you could please grab a seat. Great, thank you. Well, what a great set of opening panels. I already have a bunch of notes from those to maybe follow up with questions for our panel. My name is Michael Boswell. I'm the department head and professor of city and regional planning at Cal Poly in San Luis Obispo. I'm the co-director of today's symposium with Dr. Billy Riggs, although I have to say Billy did about 95% of the work, so I just get to enjoy the benefits. So really want to thank Billy for the tremendous effort and particularly for USF as well for all that they've done and for hosting. So our session today is going to try to pick up on some of the questions that actually came up there at the end of the first session. So our session today is called Accessible, Social, and Ethical. We'll follow basically more or less the same format. But we know that every new technology, every time our cities change in how they function, every time we change policy, that these things have cost and benefits. And the question for this panel, the big kind of question for this panel is not only will the benefits exceed the cost, which is a good thing to discuss, but more importantly, who will reap the benefits and who potentially will suffer the cost of this new technology. The utopian predictions suggest that everyone will benefit and society as a whole will be better. And that's certainly what we hope for. And of course, in the first session, we were talking about we need to make sure that happens. Transportation maybe will be cheaper. It will maybe be more environmentally friendly in this more utopian idea. But of course, on the other hand, serious questions have been raised about the potential downsides of this revolution. I remember some of the first things I was reading on autonomous vehicles about the potential downsides were the fear from transit agencies of the impact of transit systems, for example. So I'm not asking this panel to predict the future here this afternoon, but We want to answer questions like, well, what issues should we be exploring and learning more about? What questions should we be asking, particularly to the technology companies, but also to our communities? And what do we want this technology to do for us or not do for us? But first, before we get into some questions, the panelists are going to take a moment and introduce themselves. So we'll start on the far left there with Frank.
So, this is working. So my name is Frank Petrilli. I'm a land use attorney with Aaron Fox. We're a national law firm with offices in D.C., New York, LA, and San Francisco. I've been doing land use and kind of SQL work for both developers and private companies in the Bay Area for about 10 years or so. Mostly working with Facebook and kind of focused in the Mid-Peninsula region now, so no longer really super active in San Francisco. Very active in Menlo Park and a lot of other communities kind of down south. And very focused on transportation planning, housing issues, and in particular, kind of reactivation of transit too, down in the Dumbarton kind of rail corridor.
Everybody, I'm Peter Gigante. I lead the policy research team at Lyft under the public affairs sort of umbrella. I've been there for about 4.5 years and thinking through how do we express Lyft and data that we know through the policy sphere and kind of get the impact or explain the impact to drivers and to passengers and communities where we operate. So answering sort of a myriad of public policy questions. So happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
Now on to the state government side of the panel. Chris Ganson, Governor's Office of Planning and Research. By background, I'm a transportation planner and engineer. Notice I was one of the couple of people who had their hands up for the engineer category earlier. I did climate mitigation work before that, so I bring in particular an environmental perspective, but we also at OPR are thinking across everything a city needs, from traffic, land use, et cetera.
Hi, I'm Brian Soublé. I'm the Chief Counsel for the Department of Motor Vehicles, and since about 2012, we've been working on regulations for the testing and now deployment of autonomous vehicles. We hope by the end of the year, regulations will be approved that would allow driverless testing as well as deployment, meaning the public will be able to use the vehicles. I just had an email a little while ago. We're up to 44 companies that have permits to test in California, and there are over 320 vehicles out on our streets right now that are being tested autonomously. So it's a development that's happening rapidly, and we are also focusing on what is happening on a federal level, and as the last panel discussed, what is our ability going to be to still have a say on how we regulate traffic safety?
Great, thank you. Also, Elizabeth Deacon from Berkeley was originally on our schedule to join us, and she sends her regrets. Okay, so I'm going to start with my first question, and I'm just going to open this up and let whoever wants to jump in first tackle the question. And it's kind of a big question, but we can follow up with some details. But the question is, will the autonomous vehicle future offer safe, affordable, and efficient access to everyone? Or we could ask that sort of conversely, what should we be doing to ensure that it will offer access to everyone in our communities?
I guess I'll jump in first. I think we have to be realistic about when we're going to see the widespread use. We talked in the first panel about a transition period. You have to keep in mind that there are over 28 million registered cars in California. That doesn't count the heavy commercial vehicles. New vehicles sold on an annual basis are about 2 million. The average age of a car on our streets right now is 11 years. And so if you think of someone, you have to be realistic about what those first users are going to be. We know that, when you talk about the levels of autonomy, Tesla's ready as soon as they, on a regulatory front, can do it. Talking about level 3 vehicles, but that's a $100,000 car. This summer, Audi talked about releasing a level 3 vehicle, but again, that's a $100,000 car. So when are we really going to see it on a widespread use? And that's why I think where it's really going to benefit us all is when we start seeing the shared electric type vehicles in operations like Lyft and Uber. And then, of course, that's going to drive public acceptance of the use of autonomous vehicles.
just to add one little piece to that, a big question is around adoption. There's a lot of research right now to say, are people ready for autonomous vehicles? You probably see a lot of press out there saying that people are terrified or people are concerned. We think ride sharing is actually the gateway to shared vehicles. These are people who are already used to being passengers and they're already used to sharing their ride with other people. So this is just a natural extension of that. And we've seen research internally, and we're working on externally validated research that specifically Lyft passengers, are particularly primed for it. And one of the main components is hearing from people who've already taken a ride. So lots of people say, yes, they're ready to do it now, but another equivalent pool have said, I'm interested, but I want to hear a review from someone I trust. And so we think experiential marketing is going to be really important. So getting people into the cars and then getting them talking about their experience. It really should be a completely non-novel, uninteresting, completely indifferent ride. Like the ideal is that they come out and say, wow, this AV was completely unremarkable. It was lovely and simple and nothing unusual happened. And so I think you're going to see more of that. And it was the same situation when ride sharing first launched. People were like, this is crazy. Why would anyone do this? And then you start to hear from friends and from family that, oh, actually there's a lot of benefit to it. And it changes your perception of this new technology.
From my perspective, I think the key really, and this is echoing some comments that we heard, I think, from the last panel too, is making sure that shared mobility is really at the forefront of what we're doing. Reducing SOV trips, increasing mobility throughput in cities, that's the kind of thing that this tool will help, but it really is a tool, and it can be used, I think, either for, again, as a platform to allow ride sourcing, ride sharing, and if that's really at the forefront, I think that has the potential to unlock a lot of the outcomes that I think everyone in this room is probably looking or aspiring to achieve through deploying AV technology. I think the risk is, if the technology, and this is on the manufacturing side, it's on the sort of private side, the risk is if the focus is on a sort of luxury product that's available really for more high-income folks, then it's not really going to unlock any of the potential that we're seeking here today.
So, huge question. First off, obviously, and there's quite a number of ways to answer it. And just because we're near the beginning of our session, for a little context setting, I like to think of things sometimes as what will be most people you say autonomous vehicle, and once they've gotten past the robot driving my car, I'm afraid, which I think they will very quickly, and I think there's kind of research showing that then they think, well, this is going to be great. I won't have to pay attention. I'll be able to drive a long distance. It'll be potentially less expensive. Auto mobility will be potentially less expensive. My grandmother, who can't drive anymore, will be able to get around. I won't have to take her to the hospital anymore. The vehicle can take her there itself. But then there's a level back, and we think of this in kind of our Transportation 101, for those of us who did formal transportation schooling, the user perspective versus the system's perspective. How does the whole system work when everyone has this easy auto mobility? And the likely, as was raised in the last panel, what's likely going to happen, all else equal, which hopefully all else won't be equal, is that there'll be a large run-up in the amount of vehicle travel, and that will have pretty vast implications across the environment, health, traffic, etc. So it's important to be thinking on all those levels, and for us at the where I sit in my office, particularly that last kind of overarching level, systems perspective.
Great. So let me ask a few follow-ups there. So, Brian, you sort of raised this issue of this transition. So we'd be in this period, and it was raised during the Era presentation, where we would see mixed modes on the road. There would be the autonomous vehicles on the road, perhaps shared autonomous vehicles on the road, and then there would be sort of those of us left operating our own vehicles, and there may be some long transition period that's going on like this. And then Peter mentioned in particular, as I said, this issue of a shared transition occurring. So does this potentially the potential to create a have and have-nots situation? Are the folks who are willing to get in the AV or the shared AV going to be in express lanes? cruising along. They can bear a higher cost potential, and the rest of us are going to be sort of stuck and driving our vehicles, wasting our time, and not gaining the benefits. What do you think about this sort of have versus have-nots, particularly during this transition period?
The first time I started thinking about the have versus have-not, I was at a Transportation Research Board conference at Stanford. I think it was back in 2013. And a guy from GM raised his hand and said he thought that there should be special lanes for autonomous vehicles. And, I looked at him and said, hey, Bubba, who's going to pay for it? Because what happens with new technology, it typically gets introduced in the most expensive vehicles in the line. And is it a good idea to jump out the gate and have, a special lane for people driving Lexuses and Mercedes and Audis? And, that's when you start talking about the social equity. It's going to take a while for the transition to occur, but that's why it's important that we have services like Lyft. I think that we're all going to have to get used to being in the vehicles. I've been in them before. The first ride was frightening. I was riding in a vehicle on Highway 50 at 65 miles an hour, and it didn't know what to do, and it suddenly turned off. But then other times that I've ridden in it, it's been a very comfortable experience. And I think that the technology has rapidly developed that as we start getting people exposed to it, they will be more comfortable with it. I don't know about special lanes. Right now, we have the high occupancy lanes. If you didn't know, to have a high occupancy lane, there's not supposed to have certain impacts on traffic. We keep issuing new decals for new types of vehicles, and we're already past what the federal limits are on what's supposed to be happening in our high occupancy lanes. So I don't know how realistic it is to think that we're going to have, special lanes for autonomous vehicles at any point in the very near future.
Yeah, and one point worth clarifying too, or a question, I guess that's what's posing is, when we talk about autonomous vehicles, what type of vehicles are we talking about? I mean, are we talking about, single passenger kind of pods? I mean, I think in the collective imagination of a lot of laypersons, not the folks in this room, they've probably got something very different in mind than what a lot of the folks in the planning communities have in mind in terms of, again, unleashing, if we're going to kind of maintain pavement and really try and deal with congestion in a meaningful way, shift more towards an EV type of fleet. Setting the terms of that conversation and setting expectations in terms of really a focus more on HOV type or high occupancy type vehicles and not sort of single passenger vehicles. So I don't know if there's folks from the kind of manufacturers side of things in the room, but that's certainly a question I'm interested in.
Follow up. I think the lanes on our roads right now are kind of poorly used. A lot of it is due to driver error. Everyone wants to believe that they are an amazing driver and that everyone else on the road is terrible. I think we have research to show that all of us have lots of room for improvement. So from even just like a road safety perspective, I think any type of AV adoption is automatically going to add like a more conservative driver than what you would otherwise find on the road. And the more that we have connected vehicles understanding how to move traffic, HOV lanes in themselves might not be as important as the total throughput of what the roads can handle. So I think we just have a lot of opportunity for improvement and honestly not a lot of room to go further into the floor. And I think this shared autonomous fleets have the real biggest impact, not only in terms of getting around the most people, but in convincing people that they have the ability to live a car light or a car free lifestyle. And then all of a sudden we have fewer vehicles out there in circulation than the ones that are in circulation get around faster.
Again, so many issues to jump on here. It's hard to think of where to go. The haves versus have-nots are the equity issue that AVs bring up. There are so many slices to even this one. Here's a couple just little examples. So one of the maybe drawbacks of the benefit of having vehicles that drive more conservatively and safely is that they'll drive more cautiously on the highways and leave longer following distances, and that just mathematically leads to more congestion. which is less of a problem if you're in an AV because you don't have to be paying attention to driving. You can get other things done. But if you're in your old clunker because you can't afford the AV, then that's more of a cost. Maybe that's a little example of an equity issue. The last panel talked quite a bit about land use effects and sprawl. And so to think back, the last big transformation in the transportation system, the arrival of the automobile itself, that spread land use out enormously. And so having the same means for mobility, having the same means to get around, meant that you could get around and get to a lot fewer places. You were suddenly at a huge disadvantage if your mobility was held constant. So similarly, if on the mid to long run, if land uses are spread out considerably by the arrival of automated vehicles and you don't have access to one, then you're at a disadvantage there too.
Okay, let me follow off that then and tackle the issue of transit. I remember a few years ago, Rebecca Solnit wrote a piece that was very scathing anti-autonomous vehicle piece, basically because she saw it as would be the final death knell for transit, which we know not so much in the Bay Area, but in many parts of the country operates on very thin margins in terms of being able to keep transit going. Transit's been our, at least as transportation policy in the U.S., our main response to how to provide mobility equity in this country. Is transit at threat, or should, again, the flip side of the question is, what should transit agencies be doing, or what should autonomous vehicles companies be doing in terms of ensuring that transit survives, or at least the benefit of mobility equity that transit is supposed to be providing continues to persist?
I think it's a good question. We already know that's what's happening in the East Bay and in Contra Costa County is they're actually looking forward and thinking about how to use autonomous vehicles to link people that work in large business parks with getting back to a BART station. So really concentrating on a first and last mile solution where you would have an automated vehicle that maybe would take you from the BART station to the transit hub at the business park, or from a bus at the business park to where you want to be. And I know from our perspective, we see the legislation that happens this year. There are already other jurisdictions that are looking at getting the permission to be able to have this first last mile type of a solution. What's interesting for me is that for the past 4 or 5 years, that's all I've been concentrating on is the cars, because we get concerned about the safety of how the cars operate. And it wasn't until someone from San Francisco came forward and said, wait a minute, these cars we're testing in our city and we don't know what's going on. And so that's what I think, that the transportation districts have to get a little bit more interested in it. I know that they are, because we're seeing legislation being sponsored to allow not only the testing, but maybe the use of smaller, or actually it would be larger autonomous vehicles that could hold like about 12 passengers, and using it as a link to what is the existing public transportation.
I would say there's a huge opportunity for transit agencies to really supplement what they're maybe not doing well, or the services that they're not satisfied with, and a lot of that comes with first mile, last mile solutions, and connecting to those backbone, commuter rail or services that, maybe it's rapid bus transit, where they know that they're moving a lot of people very well at peak times, and that's something that even autonomous can't necessarily, anticipate changing in the near term. But in the near time, that these are services that can be supplemented. And I think you'll see a lot of talk about, these services, AV services, even Lyft, in sort of opposition to transit. And I think that's entirely the wrong perspective, both in terms of function and in terms of business alignment. There is really not a lot of money to be made pulling people off of transit. There is a ton of money, however, to be made pulling people out of personally owned vehicles and single occupant vehicles. That is an enormous, the scale is not even in the same ballpark. And so from a business perspective, we are far more interested in pulling people out of their personal vehicles and getting them into a Lyft or getting them into a Lyft AV than we would ever be of getting, non-choice riders off of a bus system. That doesn't make sense. So I think that there's huge opportunity for us to work with transit to expand what they're doing right now and just help them supplement and help them really refine what are their core efficiencies and how to make that core product better, and then see where we can be supplemental to the services that aren't necessarily the most efficient.
To start to answer this question, I think it's important to think about why we do transit, why we have transit. And three things that come to my mind right off the bat are an environmentally more efficient way to get around, subsistence travel for folks who can't afford an automobile or maybe choose not to have one, and so that we can get more people into small places. Downtown San Francisco, for example, couldn't exist without BART. Couldn't do more than half the intensity, certainly. Given that, what do we want to accomplish? As was mentioned, we can't, automated vehicles still take up, maybe someday they'll take up half the space on the road because we'll be able to drive them closer together. But in the near to midterm, they're going to still take up a lot of space. So they're not going to help with the serving an intensively land developed place like downtown San Francisco. They can feed the transit trunk lines. They could help with subsistence transit. We run, folks, kind of anti-transit folks are constantly quoting studies showing that transit isn't really that environmentally beneficial as a whole, but that's because you're averaging in those all those buses that are providing subsistence transit that are sized for 40 people and carrying 3. And we could do better for the environment and for people's ability to get places by serving those with automated vehicles. Of course, if we had some sort of subsidized Lyft, Uber for folks to get around who are using subsistence transit, we would have to start thinking about the extra vehicle travel they're going to use when it's all of a sudden a lot easier to get around. Getting around is obviously a benefit. Extra vehicle travel is a disbenefit. So that's again it's not a one-sided. The solutions come with their own problems in a lot of cases in this space, but. Basically, I think, and fundamentally, we want to keep our line haul transit, our light rail, our heavy rail, our commuter rail, and our heavily used bus lines, and we want to feed them with automated vehicles to just kind of plop the general approach that will provide the best outcome down. And doing that, if we do it, if we did it very efficiently and effectively, we could solve a lot of these problems.
Yeah, and I don't think it's a zero-sum situation either. I think the argument as it goes is, for low-income families who spend up to 30% of their income on transportation, AV, if you have kind of a shared mobility type system, would reduce those costs by something like 500%. I don't know what the numbers are, but it's going to be, I think the idea is basically we'd have a much more cost-effective alternative to transit, which is going to hit ridership, potentially cause increases in fares, that sort of thing. I don't know that I buy that, just given the amount of growth that we have and the continuing kind of demand for transit, and absolutely agree that from a sort of first last mile perspective, and given the opportunities to have these sort of private shared mobility type ecosystems really complement transit, that there's a lot of opportunity there.
Great, thank you. Let me shift gears a little bit. Another aspect of this issue, particularly around social justice issues, are environmental justice issues. And so we've touched a little bit on the potential environmental benefits of this. And sort of other than the sort of obvious likelihood that this technology will primarily be electric, and the benefits that shifting from internal combustion to electric provides. What else do you see as the potential environmental benefits, or again, what should we be doing to ensure that the AVs deliver environmental benefits, particularly communities that have been highly impacted, for example, by the negative environmental externalities of transportation systems?
So I think what you're seeing, and what our goal is, like I mentioned before, is trying to get people out of personally owned vehicles. And a lot of that is translating into more efficient. So it's not a one-for-one, because like you said, the average age of a vehicle in California is 11 years old. In these situations, they're going to be completely clean or certainly far, far, far more fuel efficient. So I think overall that's going to have a huge impact. Also, having people not personally owning vehicles means just fewer vehicles operating in general, and hopefully more use of transit, which is going to reduce the VMT and reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So I think there's going to be some network effect to the whole system once it becomes at scale. There's also going to be really interesting land use. We're predicting that at some stage of adoption, you're going to be able to cities will be able to reclaim large portions of land dedicated to parking cars that aren't used. Cars are used maybe 4% of their lifetime. The rest of the time they sit in a garage, they sit in your driveway, they sit on the street, and we know that these are underutilized resources. So one of the things we're thinking about also is like, what should cities be thinking about in terms of reclaimed land? What does that land do? And maybe some of it is parks, maybe some of it is affordable housing. And so I think there can be some environmental impact just from having land reclaimed from what we're dedicating right now to parked steel.
I think earlier in the first session there was the mention of the concept of freight, and one of the other things that we're looking at is not just necessarily vehicles being autonomous, but for example large commercial vehicles platooning, and just the fuel savings that comes from a truck being able to follow very closely behind another lead truck. The fuel savings without any changes to that diesel engine can be as much as 18%. And so, there are environmental benefits not just from, the completely driverless vehicle, but the abilities of vehicles to be able to operate more closely, especially in the freight area. And so that's why there's a lot of concentration and a lot of excitement about what could happen, both on an environmental basis and just a congestion basis if we have large, heavy vehicles that are automated and are able to follow closely.
So I mentioned at the outset I come from a climate background even before I got into transportation and planning. It's easy to think of an automated vehicle future as one being automatically electric, which there's reasons to believe it will go electric if it's a fleet vehicle future, if it's a TNC future, because of the economies of scale there. But from a policy perspective, I think it's unsafe to think of that as a foregone conclusion. I'll also bring the words of a mentor of mine, Lee Shipper, who's no longer with us, an energy and transportation guy, who called zero emissions vehicles elsewhere emissions vehicles, because the emissions still come out of power plants just somewhere else. So keep that in mind. Now, it's not to say that electric vehicles are not more greenhouse gas efficient. They certainly are. We need them, but it is possible, given the VMT increased numbers that we're seeing out of some of the modeling and research exercises on automated vehicle futures, that increase in vehicle travel could overrun the benefits from efficiency. And keep in mind, we have to do this all in a severely cranked down carbon future. Our cap, the amount of space we have to emit, goes down quite sharply in the next few decades. So we still need to think about climate. This is not an automatic solution to climate. We'll have to keep focus on that. One of the pieces of that is what vehicles people choose to use. And once your vehicle's automated and you no longer need to be staring out the windshield and hanging onto a steering wheel, what are you going to do in there? Is that going to require space? Is that space going to mean that you want a bigger car? Is your future car, your future standard car, a van that has your exercise equipment and your giant TV set and your wet bar and your whatever in there? It could be a very comfortable place, leading to yet more vehicle travel.
I think I remember that movie. It was
Things can go right there. And then there's the array of other environmental issues that are associated with how much vehicle travel there is, including the effects on land use, and maybe especially those. If we get that super sprawl, we consume a lot of sensitive habitat, ag land. We lay a lot more impermeable surface down and create flooding and pollutant transport problems into our waterways, et cetera, et cetera.
Okay, when we were polling the room earlier, I think one group we didn't ask about, is anybody here that's with a nonprofit that does environmental or social justice or housing advocacy or anything like that? So we have a few in the room. So before we go to questions and answers, one of my questions for the panel is for the advocacy community, who's often the ones out there driving the questions around environmental benefits or cost, around issues of equity and social justice. What is their role in this conversation and in this policy making around autonomous vehicles? So what's kind of the message for that part of the room that's here today?
I think they play a really important role, and I can give you as an example, when we at the DMV started working on our regulations, we did not allow the testing of vehicles that didn't have a driver, and so they had to have a driver in it. And as we started working on development of what we call our deployment regulations, the disabled community got very aware and active and started showing up at the workshops that I was holding. And one of the things that they were pointing out is the promise that autonomous technology has for people who have mobility issues right now. And really, I think with their starting to have that advocacy about the promise of autonomous technology, they're pushing manufacturers to start taking a look at, we don't want to have to buy a Dodge van and take it to somebody else and have them retrofit it so that, I can pull my wheelchair in it. I want to be able to walk into a dealership and get into any one of your vehicles, and it will be able to provide, accessibility for me. And I think that their involvement, at least with us at the DMV and talking about autonomous vehicles, started getting us to think about, when we interact with manufacturers, is, hey, there's a community with a need that is not being addressed, and they see a promise of the technology, but it's more than just the car being able to drive itself. The car has to be accessible, and I think that community is becoming more vocal.
So it's a really challenging question. I do think that for sort of specific stakeholders, whether it's the disabled community, the elderly, it's going to be a natural fit, and that we will see advocacy coming from those groups. I think part of the challenge, and this is for cities, and I'm really curious to hear from folks who are kind of active in the nonprofit space, is how do we actually prioritize this, right? Because I think the real risk from my perspective is inertia, being reactive, letting the market really take control, because outreach is really hard, getting consensus on policy is really hard. And so how do we sort of manage those risks? And so a part of it, I think, really is cities making it a priority. I mean, I've seen a couple plans kind of in California where you'll see maybe a blurb about autonomous vehicles, and these are in like TOD precise plans and specific plans and stuff. But no one really knows how to think through this stuff, and it's enormously complicated. And from that standpoint, what I'd encourage folks in this room to think about is, how do we simplify the messaging? How do we be inclusive about it? How do we demonstrate, really kind of transformative leadership in these areas, and get behind kind of a shared set of values, which again, I think there's certainly consensus probably in this room about what those are. But it's going to be tough. Yeah.
I think everybody in the room would agree that transportation is a key sort of fundamental. This affects all of us, and it affects lots of different aspects of our lives. We've already seen, even just in ride sharing, being able to expand the universe of transportation options for some people. I think we often take a sort of a city-centric focus, and maybe being in San Francisco even more so, to think that, no, transportation is great here. But there's lots of cities in America and lots of cities throughout the state where transportation options are actually very limited, and your choices are often, your own car, a friend, or some very limited service. And so we think there's a huge opportunity to bring more options to more areas. Only very recently, we've launched now fully to be able to cover all, I think it's 40 different states in the U.S., but this is a new endeavor. And so there's certainly suburban and rural areas where there's lots of work to be done, but there's also a ton of opportunity. These are people, again, who are, hopefully they have their own cars, and if not, they might be walking or biking, unreasonable distances because they don't have options available to them. And we've seen research from APTA last year, I believe it was, that looked at multimodal travel. And certainly the more options you have, the more options you are tending to use, and it's reducing your overall cost of transportation over the course of a year. So we think that AV is just a natural extension of ride sharing, and there's a lot of opportunity to bring affordable transportation options, especially to those communities that really do need more options.
I think I'll say my suggestion would be think both of the direct and obvious impacts to the constituency you serve, but also keep the full system in mind, keep that systems perspective in mind. I'll give an example that might help to illustrate that. So one of the things raised again on the last panel was perhaps the need for pricing in an AV world to make the network work, to control some of the run up in vehicle travel and that sort of thing. And as a first reaction, as an advocate for low income residents, it might say, well, pricing, my constituents can't afford to pay to use the roadway. If you look though at how we're funding roadways now, which is largely through sales tax dollars, that's worse for the lowest income quartile than pricing the roads. So making sure that you're looking at the full picture in these potential responses that could be needed for the whole system to work will be important, I think.
Yeah, thanks for that thought, Chris. I agree. We tend to think of it as just the literal cost of the transportation itself, but we're certainly likely to see a lot of shifting cost in terms of needs for infrastructure and questions about how that will be financed. If gas taxes are going away in an electric vehicle future, how are we paying? And again, what are the are these regressive fees? Are cordon fees, which a lot of communities have talked about, pricing into downtown cores, or these regressive fees? I think that'll be important to keep an eye on the big picture, or the total picture, I guess I should say, of cost and benefits. Okay, let's open it up to some questions, and I think we have a mic that will go around. Why don't we start right here in front of me?
Hi, my name is Kamala Parks. I work for the City of Berkeley as a transit coordinator as well as other things, and we helped actually institute one-way car share in Oakland and Berkeley recently, which is expanding the universe of transportation options. One thing that I'm not hearing too much is, we talk about the loss of jobs. A lot of people have either become TNC drivers or transit agencies. Their biggest cost is labor. And so they might be super motivated to move towards an automated vehicle system. And one of my fears is that sort of the solar versus coal is going to happen with transportation. And I don't hear a lot of talk about how we're going to address that from the systems level.
I think that's an interesting point. For example, when we're working on regulations for vehicles now, we exclude certain vehicles from testing, and we had been calling them commercial. And then the Highway Patrol said, no, you have to use a specific reference to a specific section of the vehicle code, and that would exclude certain types of vehicles that people are planning on right now. Like we want to get a van-sized vehicle, and it would be for a package delivery, right? And you need to change this proposed regulation that you're about to implement by the end of the year to include that. And one thing internally at my department that we started talking about is like, whoa, wait a minute, let's slow down and think about this. What happens to those people right now that are making ends meet by doing these jobs where they're, driving for Amazon, or they're the FedEx driver, they're the UPS driver? Should the discussion be, yes, the benefits of autonomous technology are great, but do we want to come, like the upper Midwest, where we've got this class of people who are counting on these jobs? Should what happens with people who are currently doing things be part of the equation as you start introducing the technology? DMV, we don't have the answer to that, but part of the discussion, as we start allowing things, we at least need to introduce into the conversation what happens to the human element that's maybe displaced by the introduction of technology.
If I may, we get asked this obviously a lot, especially around TNC drivers. One of the things that I work on is specifically understanding who are the drivers, what are their motivations, and what are they expecting to get out of the service. It's a very, very small, it's about 7% of people nationally among all drivers who view Lyft as a full-time permanent employment opportunity or sort of earning opportunity. Most people are employed in other roles, full-time or part-time, or they're retired or students, or people who are between jobs, and Lyft is sort of providing a secondary safety net while they're looking for their next gig. So I understanding that everyone's very nervous about AV technology and what's going to happen to the drivers. And there's two things I would say. One, we know that this is a long tail. We don't expect AV to come overnight. And so as the technology develops, we still see there's huge room for human drivers. We are currently a very small percentage of 1% of all the VMT driven in the US. And again, as I was saying, if we're actually pitting ourselves against personal vehicle ownership, there is so much room for growth. And for us to grow, drivers are necessary for the near term, at least for the next 5-10 years that we envision. Beyond that, we spend a lot of time, money, and resources attracting drivers and trying to get them to stay active on the Lyft platform. But there's natural attrition that will occur when we stop putting time, effort, and money into that. People, like I said, because they are employed, they have other priorities in their life, they naturally will be falling off the platform. So I don't think that we will ever have to really say to somebody, no, you can't drive anymore, we don't need you. I think that this is going to be a long process. We are definitely going to be needing drivers in the foreseeable future. We're also curious to see where the role of driver changes, especially with certain populations. We know we've been very involved with non-emergency medical transportation, mobility for the elderly, mobility for persons with disabilities, and we're thinking there might be a future where the role of the driver transitions to more of assistant, getting you into the car, getting you out of the car. And so I think that the concerns are understood and are valid, but I don't think that this is an immediate issue that requires sort of big actions right now, because I think we have a lot of time to understand what the role of the driver is going to be.
Let's take another question. We can just stick right here. Yeah.
Thanks. Ryan Snyder with Transpo Group. And actually, as a follow-up to that, I think that the biggest downside of all this is going to be job loss. There's over 4 million people that have jobs in driving. But the flip side of that is I think there will be economic benefits. And it's one reason I think that once this transition happens, it will happen quickly. For example, with buses, one thing we haven't talked about with transit is over half the cost of operating a bus is the driver. And you take that out of the equation and transit operators can operate a lot more service. But I have a question for Peter. What percentage of your costs are the driver, and without having to pay a driver, what would your per mile cost be for a Lyft service and for Lyft line service? And what would that do for being able to transport more people?
Excellent questions. I'm sure that there are lots of operations folks back at HQ who are focused on that very issue. I unfortunately don't have an answer. I do imagine that the human cost is a very major component. Like same as it is for transit, I'm sure it is for us, but I unfortunately don't have a figure as to what that. But we are envisioning that the cost of transportation in the AV future is significantly lower and becomes much more accessible to all folks.
Yeah, and approaching this from a sort of systems thinking perspective too. I mean, if the idea is that if what we wind up achieving is, again, enhanced mobility throughput, reduced congestion, the ability of folks to get access to jobs in kind of downtown cores and outside, there are positive externalities associated with it too. So I think it's going to be a mixed bag, and absolutely it's going to have a huge impact. I suspect, if I were advising Uber and Lyft, I would strongly encourage, really robust community benefits program in terms of job training, all that kind of stuff too. Just from a political perspective, I think that's the right thing to do. But yeah, there are going to be people who lose out, and that's not really unique to this change. I think that happens every time you've got a major paradigm shift in terms of how people move around.
Just throw in really briefly that the number of jobs lost is going to be really substantial, and yes, it will take time. Yes, it will need attention, and yes, we need to give it way more attention than we've given it so far. There are potential for a lot of positive. For a lot of positives come out of that, and this to be a real economic generator. As we've talked about already, there's potential for it to be an economic divider in sending money into pockets that there's already a lot of money in, and slowing the flow into those which there's not much. And there's also potential. I mean, the what we're looking at in terms of the additional vehicle travel that may result from these is a real exacerbation potentially of the collective action problem we have today on our roads, that we all want to use them at the same time and all get stuck on them going really slow. And we have those collective action problems to solve if we're going to get these benefits to counteract the disbenefits.
Okay, here in the
just wanted to add one.
Yeah, and here in the blue, but go ahead while they're getting here to the microphone.
Just a quick question. It's just a framing of it. Again, it's very easy for us to imagine what is being lost from what we have currently. It's much, much harder for anyone to envision. How are we going to develop once this technology? What is the ecosystem that pops up after we actually have this technology? And I would offer, there's lots of situations where people were expecting massive job losses to technology. I remember when, Intuit and tax software were supposed to put accountants out of business. It's never happened. So I think there's a lot more to be gained from this that we just aren't creative enough yet to really imagine.
All right, thank you so much. My question is really about data and data sharing, because we don't really know what the social or the equity impacts are unless we're actually measuring it. And so my question is for the governmental agencies: what are you going to require, and also try to collect, because there's different ways, of course, to collect that information, both kind of from that public side as well as requiring data to be shared from those private companies that might want to actually protect some of that. And there's also, of course, privacy concerns as well. So how will you make sure that we're measuring and we understand what those different impacts are?
And we have to lightning round this. Billy gave me 1 minute. So lightning round responses, please. Maybe a couple of responses.
We've gotten that a lot because we are collecting data about what the cars are doing when they disengage, when they get in accidents. But the one thing that you look at is that why are we collecting the data, and that's whether they're operating safely. One of the things is the fleet of vehicles that are out there right now, although it sounds large, 322 vehicles, that's not a lot. So they're not collecting a whole lot of data right now. And so you have to start thinking of other ways for you to collect data that might be useful.
Okay, one more quick response.
I'll just chime in really quick. The data is critical. Yes, there are competitive issues with the companies that would supply it that are real. There are some ways to get that data in a way that doesn't compromise the competitive possibilities for those organizations nor the privacy, and we need to do more of that.
Great. Well, I would like to thank the panel. It's always too short, but it was a great conversation. So thank you very much for participating.
And it sounds like data can be maybe something we pursue on the last panel. So we have a little time for a break. I'm going to keep us driving at a mile a minute. We are going to convene back here in about 5 minutes. We have another survey up. If you're participating in those, we'd like to invite you to do that. We also have a jar out on the table. We're going to draw a business card from that jar later if you want to contribute it at the registration table for either a tour of the Tesla factory or, conversely, a ride in a autonomous vehicle. And we're not going to divulge what level of autonomy at this point. But if you want to perhaps engage in those, we're going to try to work on that for you.
So we are starting anytime, so if you could wrap up your conversations and find your seat. If you could find your seat. I'm sure there are great conversations. Let's have some more great conversations. This side of the room is awesome for the most part. This side of the room is the unruly side. Middle is in the middle. Okay. All right, so it's time for our last panel of the day. Once again, I'd like to echo the other moderators in thanking the organizers of this, as well as UCSF. Today, we're gonna finish the day by talking about budgets and economics and finance. So we have. So first, I'd like to say I am Melissa Rule. As you know, I am not Menka Sati from Facebook. She had some obligations come up, so she couldn't make it. So we have 5 great panelists here for you. The first is Deborah Stam. Again, my list doesn't reflect the order. Deborah Stam is a senior associate with Trammell Crow, focusing on development and investment. She focused on the intersection of tech and business as a part of her MBA at Stanford. We also have Rob Rossi, who is one of the leading developers on California's Central Coast, and he's the president of Rossi Enterprises. Next, we have Jay Stark, who is the president at Integral Investment Management, a real estate firm in Southern California, and advisor on opsites.com, the premier network connecting city leaders and real estate development professionals. Next, we have Ralph McLaughlin. He is the chief economist at Trulia, where he leads real estate market research. He is a former professor at San Jose State University and a former professor of mine. And University of South Australia. And finally, we have Ben Clark, who is an assistant professor at the University of Oregon, focusing on municipal budgets and finance. So without further ado, we will go into our questions. And the questions are going to focus on pricing, on budgets, on finance, infrastructure, and economics. So the first question to ask is, what are the range of impacts on budgets, economics, infrastructure, and development economics? And Ben, would you like to start?
All right, so I think one of the challenging questions we have with the AV sort of impact and kind of thinking about the city and sort of in my perspective is that there's such a diversity of cities and a diversity of economies and sort of how that's going to impact is going to be very different in San Francisco or Portland than it would be in, say, Youngstown or Cleveland. And sort of the available land here is much less, the demand is much higher. And so compared to, a Rust Belt city, for example, or even some suburbs that are struggling around very vibrant cities. And so as we sort of think about, what is that impact going to be, you have to really think about the context in a way very specific to what that place looks like. So I think a lot about, the property tax and sort of what's going to happen there. And I can't decouple it from what's already happened with e-commerce and sort of the hollowing out of our brick and mortar and what that's done and what it's going to continue to do, and AVs are likely to really exacerbate that. So I'll just kind of leave it there and let some other people take over.
I'm happy to take the floor. So I think that there's going to be 2 impacts on real estate development and investing, and one's kind of the what gets built, what type of product, what it looks like, how it interacts with parking, and then the where it gets built. And that being, are we going to have suburbanization 2.0 and massive sprawl, or are we going to have increased densification of cities? And I think actually that is probably the more interesting impact and the more dramatic impact that will happen from autonomous vehicles. We'll certainly see differences in how buildings are built, maybe less parking, maybe different curb interaction. We haven't really talked much today about flying cars, but if and when those happen, you might end up with sky lobbies. And I think there's ways that the product itself will be different, but I think the really dramatic swings are going to happen in the where things get built. And I think it's not even just where things get built within an MSA, it's amongst MSAs. So I think that there's a potential for megacities to be able to get even bigger. Because if you think about some of the downward pressures on these big cities, congestion and affordability are 2 of the major issues. And if transportation reduces some of those frictions, then you may have even more people being able to move to megacities.
I'd agree with that. I live in a small town, but I many years ago grew up in northern Ohio at the beginning of the decline and it's fun to go back today because it's starting to revive itself. It only took 50 years, but and many things happened along the way, and certainly it was very displaced a lot of workers and a lot of industries, but again, it's starting to thrive. I spent the last 50 years since going to college here in California, and it's sort of like Never Never Land. You think it's always going to go up in price and value, and I think there's driving forces that have created that, but I think this new technology has equally important forces to take into account. We are a landlord primarily, and we lease to almost every kind of business imaginable, from hospitals to vineyards to office buildings. And I would say over the last 30 years, well, I'd say over the last 10 years, there's been such a dramatic shift in the need and type of occupancies. We built our first Costco 30 years ago, just did a new one. It's double the size. At the same time, retailers are shrinking. And I think the autonomous vehicle is just going to add to that. And I think it's coming. I think, like the discussion today, there's no way to stop it. What are the implications? And I think really, what do you want the outcome to be? What do you want cities and places that we live in to be? And I'm lucky in San Luis Obispo, the people that were there 50 years ago thought about it as we are today and trying to decide the impacts of these changes in parking and transit and work.
There we go. First, I'll start with true confessions. Is that when I get in a car, I get car sick, and when I get car sick, I get tired. I don't know if anybody you get sleepy. So I'm really looking forward to AVs because I'm going to catch up on my sleep, because I naturally go to sleep in cars, and it's going to help in the hopefully near future catch up the Z's that I'm looking for. And this morning, I think about, I guess, AVs and real estate development, and we're national investors, developers, from 10 million square foot mixed use projects to, we just finished a mixed income project here in San Francisco. We're in pre-development on a high rise here as well that we can talk about. But we really look at it from the user perspective, how development's going to get done in the future. And I think first, and this morning, I got on a plane from Los Angeles and came up here for this. And I look forward to the time. Probably, I think the first thing that's going to happen is I'm not going to be getting on that many planes, because if I can get up at 4 or 5 or 6 in the morning and work in my AV and get into San Francisco 4 hours later, you're going to see a big impact first on regional aircraft and regional transportation, on how that happens, and that's the sort of the first layer. But we see this as the biggest land rush, gold rush that has been around for 200 years. I mean, the 25, 30, 40% of whatever the land uses that are going on right now, whether you're a motel on an old state highway or you're a gas station, buy up as many car dealerships as you can right now, because it's all going away, and it's going to be opportunities for housing at all income levels, redoing placemaking experiences. So that's what we're focused on. We're already, in our large master plan community that we have in Atlanta, we're already bifurcating out the parking from the buildings, so that when the parking goes away, we can build more buildings, and that's called free land, which is a good thing in real estate development. So we're really focused on that. And then from the user perspective, we're focused on fleets. We think the whole thing is fleets, no matter if you're in San Luis Obispo or Los Angeles. And that my favorite restaurant, the whole concept of getting to-go food is actually going to be me, because my favorite restaurant's going to have their own car to pick me up and bring me to them. And Home Depot, I'll never go to another Home Depot because they'll have their own fleet. And as soon as you start thinking about, as long as I don't have to go to someplace, and someone is, then the real estate demand, the commercial demand, or people are going to provide those services across the board. So I'll stop there and let other folks continue. So.
So first, I'm just going to give a very self-interested plug for a piece that came out on Monday, op-ed in Fast Company that I wrote. Perhaps that was more appropriate for the earlier session on inequality, both social and economic. But some of the principles that I write about, I think, apply here very much so. So as an economist, as a housing economist, what I'm most interested in is what Deborah talked about, which is where demand is going to shift. Most directly, I think it's going to spread out cities. I think demand is going to go far out. I don't think it's going to destroy cities for two particular reasons. If you look at the two reasons why cities sort of stick together, metropolitan areas are somewhat cohesive, it's because there are strong centripetal forces that keep people there or as close as possible. First is agglomeration economies, which, the Bay Area is a perfect example of an agglomeration economy where certain industries really benefit from having lots of other competitors or actors in that industry together. Bay Area, perfect example of that. I don't think agglomeration economies are going to go away with AVs, because that is fundamentally about the exchange of information, knowledge, and labor. AVs, I don't think are going to touch that at all. However, where AVs do come into play is the second centripetal force, which is the friction of distance, especially of labor. It is almost prohibitively expensive, both in time and cost, for employees to say live 2 or 3 hours away and commute to take advantage of this agglomeration economy. It's very difficult, especially for wealthier households that have a high value of time. AVs upend that, especially for knowledge workers, because the friction, one of the main friction of distance, is the way that someone can use time while they're commuting. If I can sit in my little office of an AV, suddenly I don't have a problem commuting 2 hours each way, because that's 2 hours of productive time. If I think about the time that I spend in my office as a knowledge worker, only about half is actual time that I'm meeting with people and exchanging ideas and knowledge. The other half is I've got my headphones on and I'm trying to crank out work. I can now do that in a car, and perhaps even live in a place as far away as the Sierras, if my preferences allow that, if I like open space. But the third part of this also comes down to the preferences of households. It doesn't matter. If I like urban environments, I'm going to live in an urban environment, whether I want to or not. And so that won't change things. But as if high-income households have preferences for being in non-urban environments, and the only reason they're in urban environments now is because of this friction of distance, that might spur a huge exodus of especially wealthy households, not just to the suburbs, but further into the exurbs or rural areas. And if you look through the history of advancements in transportation technology, the streetcar, the automobile, the interstate highway system, that all pushed people out. And wealthy households were the first ones to go that direction. So as much as that plays in the types of real estate that those households are going to demand, or for any household for that matter, that's really, in my mind, the inflection point that we need to study as to what types of housing products are going to be built and where there's going to be increased demand for new housing.
So to build on that, a little bit, can you all talk about or say what you've thought about around the topic of policy and how we can use policy to create better cities, or maybe to preserve the arable lands and sensitive environments that are outside of our cities, to make the kinds of to make a state, really, we can't be talking about region anymore, that we want.
I just recently in San Luis Obispo, and this has nothing to do with AVs, has to do with energy. We have a nuclear power plant that many of you have heard is closing. And who would have ever thought that it's closing because it's non-economic? And it's non-economic because of public policy. And the policy was to encourage alternative energies. The state was aggressive with that. And I think the outcome of conversion to solar and wind and others have led the way in the country. And it's certainly changed the nature of PG&E and Diablo Canyon. And I suspect that similar policies might encourage this conversion in a constructive way. I think the earlier panel touched on the displacement of drivers. We were in Washington, D.C. 2 months ago, and our Uber driver said, what do you do for a living other than this? And he says he's a DNA sequencer, but he doesn't make enough money doing that. So he drives, and he wants to drive as much as he can before the autonomous vehicle comes along. And I think that's sort of the story of our society. This is a big change. And I think there is going to be large displacements, and we're at the beginning of it, so we can try to anticipate what those displacements are. But I think public policy, thoughtful public policy, like I think the energy conversion was, is what we probably should devote our thinking to.
I think this has been talked about already in some of the earlier panels, but I think it makes all the sense in the world to have some sort of a VMT fee come into play, especially as we have conversion to electrification, and we have the potential to have a lot more driving as people can live 2 hours away and commute in their office, although I personally would still not want to do that, but I know there are people out there who would. But I think it could be not just a VMT tax, but I think there's a potential to create sort of a smart VMT tax that can be, that can incorporate congestion pricing, and that can incorporate fee for stopping at curbsides, and that can really be very, very sensitive and sort of like the way economists dream about, to actually incentivize people towards the behaviors we want, because we have the technology to do this now. It's actually a possibility. So I think that's likely where things will go. I kind of hope that's where things will go. I think that's the way to maximize benefit.
I mean, just on what Deborah said, in California, obviously we have a huge housing crisis, and it comes from many policy choices, but one is in the the aftermath of Prop 13, that we tax so heavily new development because there is not a source. It is the low-hanging fruit of the tax officials, and as we go to AV, it feels like it's more, people call it so-called driving. It's not driving, it's moving, or whatever it's going to be called. But it starts to feel more like a utility or a shared cost, and whether it is a VMT. But if as developers we don't have to be providing all of that parking or all those impacts, or because we're not impacting them in the same way, that's an opportunity to have a much fairer structure that can result in much better outcomes, better development outcomes, better equity outcomes. And I think we're all looking forward to that. On the development side, I mean, I'll talk about a project that we have in San Francisco, 450 units. We're in pre-development on Market Street, and we're capped at 0.25 parking spaces per unit, so one space per 4 units. So it's very, very low. We're off market. We have a side street, and we're looking at vacating half the street because we control the frontage on that street, and returning it as a public park. So front door of our building, great result. A park for the neighborhood that never would have been there. We're putting a drone pad in the building. We just finished a building a year ago. We would not have even thought of it, so we're already thinking about these things. But we see in the urban environment an opportunity to probably reclaim 20 to 25% of the streets, and that's a heck of a lot of open space, and things that can be programmed. Now, how it gets paid for is going to be an interesting part, but we're going to pay for that as a development company, and it will be a beautiful, hopefully linear park. We need, of course, fire to approve it, and transportation and others, and we'll see how it goes. But that's an example that you can replicate in a lot of different places.
So I would echo definitely some of the other things that folks have said here, but to sort of add on to that, I think one of the policy areas I think that has to be addressed really early on is to try and avoid the decimation of public transit as a utility, and really, I guess if I were the director of a public transit agency, which I never will be, But if I were and somebody wanted me to do that, I would say, embrace the AV, make it part of your system, whether that's partnering with somebody like Lyft and, getting that first last mile, or just operating a fleet of AVs yourself and having a flexible fleet that can feed into your trains, into your buses, and that kind of thing, rather than seeing it as a real threat. Is like, hey, this is coming. This is something that we can deal with, and really shaping your policy and your transit policy around that, because I just don't see a future of public transit that's going to be sustainable on the current fiscal models that we have. Really moving forward without really embracing it and trying to get more ridership into them.
Yeah, I think from a policy perspective, one thing that we need to keep an eye on is how local governments are funded, how their services and infrastructure are funded. A little bit more up Ben's alley than mine. But if you look at one of the ramifications of white wealthy flight in the 60s. Excuse me, I'm sounding more like a historian than an economist, so excuse me for that. But if you look at what happened there, it wasn't just the wealthy leaving. It was the wealthy leaving with their money and taking their tax dollars with them, and it hollowed out a lot of our cities. It caused local governments, especially those that were the smaller and more fragmented areas, to really lose their tax base, which affects the quality of schools, the quality of other public services, roads, recreation, so on and so forth. And I think, again, you tell me if I'm crazy, but if AVs induce another flight, especially if that flight is primarily wealthy households, we may be in the same boat that we were 40, 50 years ago. And so we need to think about how we might be able to design policies to reduce those negative externalities that might arise. Fortunately, there's been a fairly good natural experiment, which was in the Twin Cities. Anyone here read Metropolitics, American Metropolitics, Myron Orfield? Anyways, in the I think it was in the 80s and 90s, the Twin Cities experienced this exact problem where new growth and development and wealthy households went to the periphery. The inner city was hollowed out, and they passed legislation that actually, required these wealthy suburbs to share some of their tax dollars, some of the benefits they got from new growth and wealthy households moving there, with inner cities to at least reduce these problems that might arise. So I think that's something from a regional and even a state level perspective. We need to think about how local services are actually funded, and maybe moving more away from local funding and more towards regional or state level.
That's very interesting. So to build on this idea of investing in our cities and making our cities great, sustainable communities, entitlement is key, and getting entitlement right and making it benefit communities and cities, at the same time making it easy for developers. So my question here is, when cities and funding institutions don't know what the future holds, when there's uncertainty about when and what happens to entitlement? So how can we encourage development in our cities, infill development, sustainable development, while also acknowledging that the future is highly uncertain?
I wish I had the answer to that one. I think that when everything's moving at the same time, it's very difficult to get your arms around it. The gentleman at the end mentioned the drone. We've got a runway on one of our properties, and over the last 6 years, the last 2 years, we have 6 companies that are testing drones, both for delivery, for measuring railroad track widths, for delivering armaments, to doing everything under the sun that they can do with drones, and now they're testing autonomous vehicles. We live out in the middle of, a very small rural area, so I'm sure if that's going on there, it's likely going on everywhere. And I think when all of this is changing, it's very difficult to figure out land use and policy that relates to land use. And I think our city, our little town, is struggling with it. But I think we're trying to focus on, why do people want to be together? What's the sense of community and the purpose. And I think it's still, as was mentioned before, a purpose of having an urban society is preferred by many. But I do think autonomous vehicles will free up the hinterland, and people are going to come live further out and commute and work in their car and maybe exercise in their car, I don't know, or whatever you call that thing that they're in. So I think it's going to have unintended consequences like most things. So I think focusing on what you can do, public policy, and trying to anticipate the changes. We're building 3 new car dealerships in our town, and I think it's exactly right. They're a dinosaur, and they're investing millions in something that's going to go away in probably less than 20 years. So I don't know who's going to guide that, but that's the nature of going after the tax dollar.
I mean, remember, we used to have redevelopment agencies in California until our governor, who I like, actually got rid of them. He got lucky. And cities used to, cities on one side of a freeway versus the other side of the freeway, used to steal car dealerships with just tax increment dollar. They'd give them a loan because they knew they could make it back 5x in 10 years. Those are now going to be, they can't do it anymore under redevelopment, but those old deals are going to look pretty bad. On the entitlement side, there's very little certainty, unfortunately, in the California entitlement environment in most places. But it is the responsibility role of the public sector to run those processes and, more important, set the table for the expectations and the rules. And so the ability to, first and foremost, get rid of all parking requirements everywhere. Let's just start there. It's just like, let's go through the code and see, it makes no sense. I don't care if you're San Luis Obispo or wherever, LA or in the Sierra Mountains. So get rid of that, and then start coming up with the rules around what the public sector is going to be able to do, incentivize, provide. Maybe take that FAR, the buildable square footage that you had expected to get from parking, and add it to the buildings. Is a good start, because most calculations for density started out with deducting all the area that you needed for parking. So if you don't have that, so just give us that back, right? And we'll call it even. But the sooner you can start have some of those rules changed, and then the AV integrated into the system, the private sector is going to be able to adapt. And like I said, we're focusing on businesses and companies leading the way, not real estate development companies, but service providers who just are going to jump on this because it's going to be a way to get to the customer. Just look at obviously look at Amazon. They're going to follow that lead, and so whatever needs to be sent to you will be sent, or you will be brought to them. So if you take that as the base, you're a good start.
Piggybacking on that, I think there is some interesting opportunities around increasing density and increasing FAR. If you think one of the reasons that density is often opposed is because of congestion and traffic and parking, and those are no longer issues, we should be able to increase FAR. And that's actually could also be a potential solution for some of these funding issues, because if you can trade FAR for more fees to the city, this may help with some of the funding gaps that we may be looking at. So I think some of these may start kind of weaving together, and there might be creative solutions that we can come up with that look at the whole system and everything that's happening.
In terms of kind of getting to the question of the uncertainty, for me, if I'm talking to the mayor or city council, I would say, what kind of city do you want? Like, what do you want it to look like? Don't even think about the AV. Think about what do you want in your city? And kind of getting back to some of what Ralph was talking about, this it's kind of the centrifugal force that holds the city together. It's like, what is it? What does this place want to be? And then start to think about, like, well, what kind of infrastructure do we need for that? Taking out the AV question. So if you want a more walkable, bikeable city, then build it. And put the things in place that you need that. So take away the parking places and put in bike lanes. That's great. Do those kind of things. But also kind of thinking about it in terms of a flexible framework, I think, which is really important to sort of alleviate some of those concerns that folks have that, we still have cars, we still have people that are going to drive cars, we get rid of all parking now, we're just going to be stuck in a traffic jam trying to find the 3 spots that are left in town. And you don't want to create that problem. So it's sort of adapting over time, something that sort of can adjust to, well, now we have a shared fleet that's this percent, and the reduction in parking maybe would go down over increments or something like that. But I think it really goes back to the question of what do you want your city to be, rather than like how can we adapt our city to be the mecca for AVs.
Yeah, I agree with Ben in a lot of ways, that cities have the potential to be very nice places for people to live, especially for those that like urban environments. And that's really without a lot of coordinated central planning, just because the need for parking, many of which is owned by private landowners, are going to want to switch to another highest and best use, which isn't parking. So that's number one. And number two, the city itself, and we're talking about a time when AVs are sort of fully adopted and ubiquitous, they're going to be much safer for people that like to live in environments and walk and bike. I don't know if anyone exclusively makes a decision not to live in a city now because it's dangerous to walk or bike, but it's sort of the icing on the cake if you're torn between, say, living in the suburb or living in the city. So for those that have preferences to live outside, I think AVs are absolutely going to allow people to fulfill those preferences or better match them than they are now. But for those that have urban preferences, say like Deborah, the cities are by themselves are probably going to become much nicer places even without coordinated central planning efforts. And the central planning efforts that we can would be needed for things like open space that the private sector might not normally provide or might not provide at a scale that the public demands.
So one of the things that's come up on this panel already, as well as all the other panels, is the centrality of parking. So are you right now changing the way you develop to lessen parking? Are there things that you are doing right now to prepare for an autonomous vehicle future? And if not, are there things you wish you could be doing or that you may be doing soon?
We've, for a long time in San Luis, tried to encourage less parking for all the reasons that have been mentioned here. And, it often falls on deaf ears for various reasons. But we had the good fortune as a community that Amazon came and wanted an engineering hub there. And they wanted to be downtown and without parking, and to really be the focal point of an urban existence. And I think they helped look at this possibility of significantly changing the parking attitude. In fact, we were talking earlier about a parking structure that is near one of our properties that the city's had in process for 5 or 6 years. And I think at this juncture, even though it would benefit us today, we're looking at maybe it's better that it doesn't get built. And I think we're kind of at the cusp of that moment. And if we're wrong, the land is still there and it could still become something over the next 4 or 5 years. But San Luis is a compact, small community. It's designed itself to be that. And I think today it's a desirable place to live in its downtown, just like I think San Francisco is on a much larger scale. And so I think that, again, it gets back to policy. They're going to have to adopt a new land use policy that says eliminate the parking. But I think that they will come. We just finished we call them the brownstones, some townhomes downtown, just to see if it would work. They're 4 stories high and kind of patterned after an urban townhome. And all 7 of them, there were only 7, sold pretty fast. And they were all people that lived in the country before that wanted to live downtown and be part of that urban fabric. So I think there is a growing demand at all levels of the spectrum, economically and job-wise, that encourages that urban life. Not for everybody. There isn't one solution that necessarily fits all.
The biggest real estate story going on right now in America is Amazon's HQ2, and we're one of many in the hunt for it with a site. And I can say they're not looking for places with parking, right? I mean, if you want to look at it, talk about it as an economic development strategy, you might not get Amazon HQ2, but you might get Mercedes or X, Y, and Z or somebody, and they're trying to attract people who want an urban environment and walkable cities. So if you want to, as these guys were saying, you want to create that because that might be your next Amazon coming to your town or your place, wherever, and there's 100,000 different Amazon type economic development opportunities. That just happens to be the biggest one, and I think it's going to set it should remind everyone and set the table for what you should be looking for in the future, because they're the golden standard.
I would agree with what's been said. I think I've had this conversation a lot with a lot of developers, and people are starting to think about it. People are certainly starting to think about, like, should we continue to have parking? But often you still have to, and the fight with the jurisdiction, just like you're not going to win it, and so it's not worth the effort. And then in cases where you're building more than is required by code, what I've seen when I've had these conversations and seen how people are looking at projects that are about to break ground is everyone's scared to take away the parking because we don't know if the change is going to be in 2 years or in 5 years. And in urban areas you're having more transit and you're having more TNCs, and so there's some reduction in people needing cars. But in car-centric cities, a lot of developers are still scared to pull the plug because they don't know how fast the technology is going to come, and more importantly, how fast the policy around it is going to come. And they don't want to end up delivering an apartment building that has no parking and being unable to rent it. So I think people are starting to think about it and they want to go that way, but having the certainty in policy is what's going to allow us to get over that precipice.
I think it's going to be incremental. I mean, anything that's instantaneous is probably going to be difficult, if not detrimental. But, it started in San Luis, again, small, with 10 units with no parking, and then all of a sudden 40 units with no parking, and all of a sudden everybody said, "Gee, the town still works," and so it's on that path. We're not there yet.
All right. To bring it back to budgets, as the need for infrastructure increases, yet public revenues are decreasing. How do we pay for infrastructure and all these nice things that we want? How do we fill the budget gaps that are today and that are coming tomorrow?
All right. So I think some of the suggestions that have already been made, kind of talking about VMT, some of the things that we've sort of started to explore in our research is sort of a modified version of that, sometimes referred to as a geometry tax, thinking about not only the number of miles are driven, but the number of occupants. And so that can sort of help to alleviate some of the negative externalities that we could potentially see happening if you have a bunch of cars with nobody in them. Tax them higher than you would with a car with 4 people. So use the taxing mechanisms not only to generate revenue that's going to be lost with a transition to electrification. That's going to happen regardless of AV. And we're already seeing that pinch, and we can't afford the infrastructure that we have right now. So I think that's sort of one of the things, kind of 2 birds with 1 stone. But I think in terms of a municipal fiscal sustainability, they really need to think about diversity of revenue. Because when you kind of look across the last 20 or 30, 40 years, cities that are more diverse in how they're collecting revenue and the different sources of revenue, they're going to have a more sustainable future. And so I think really trying to think of different places in which we can think about finding either new sources or changing in those sources of revenue is going to be really, really key. Again, it kind of back to I think the first point I made, that it's going to vary a lot across the country. And so I think some of the cities that are struggling and have a lot of vacant land and a lot of pockets within them that are empty, ready for redevelopment now, but nobody knocking on the door to build HQ2 there, or anything like that they're going to continue to struggle, and they're going to have to be more creative than say San Francisco might have to.
So we're about ready for Q&A. I'm going to ask one last question. It'll be the lightning round of the last panel, so be thinking of your questions. So what is one thing you find most encouraging and or one thing you find most worrisome about AVs?
To me, it's one and the same. I think it's going to displace a lot of people in their current jobs, and that's just a cost, and we should look out for it. But I think the opportunities are immense. Just one example, we have a couple of hospitals that we work with, and when you're planning out the campus and you're worrying about parking, I mean, it's a place that you take people that are ill, and then when you get there, you don't want to leave mom off at the front door and then have to go hunt for a parking space. So you can see a lot of solutions coming from autonomous vehicles, both getting people to those kind of places and being able to spend people time with them instead of parking time with them. So I think it's a very optimistic future.
I think that there's my downside or my pessimistic future is kind of massive sprawl. And the economic and environmental and social impacts of that. But I think there's also a real opportunity for affordability, for a solution for affordability and equality here, because a lot of issues around affordability have to do with not having density and or people being against density, not being allowed to have more density, and people having to choose between affordability and a very, very long commute. So if we can have more people in large urban areas that are able to commute in faster ways or in less expensive ways, I think it's really going to help equality and affordability in large cities.
Two things I'm very hopeful and optimistic about. First and foremost is the potential to save lives. We lose between 35 and 40,000 people a year in car accidents, so I'm optimistic that number is going to drop. Second thing I'm optimistic about is the role that AVs will play in actually helping households match their housing preferences, because this friction of distance that exists now prevents some of that. If people are better able to match their housing preference, that's a net increase in social welfare from an economist perspective. The thing I'm most pessimistic about, this is probably no surprise given what we talked about earlier, are the equity impacts that come from this, especially the impacts that potentially come on the quality of public services, the quality of education that might arise if wealthy households flee our urban centers.
I think starting on the optimistic side, for me is the access to transportation for people who don't have easy access to transportation now. So whether that's elderly or disabled or people that are too young to drive yet responsible enough to be out on their own, and kind of getting them out and mobile in ways that they're not now. I think the equity issue is going to be really key on the pessimistic side, particularly when it comes to public transit. And sort of who is using it and who is, and how much that AVs might decimate that or not.
On the optimistic side, I mean, I think it's the chance to remake the urban fabric for the future that we're all imagining right here today. On the pessimistic side, it's kind of American culture. Bruce Springsteen's next hit song is not going to be, I was driving my in my autonomous vehicle with my hair blowing in the wind, right? I mean, there is a culture that is a freedom of choice culture, and how do you, and you can't dismiss it, and we see right now what happens when we dismiss our culture in different ways. And so you have to understand, we live in a culture right now where there, a history of freedom of choice, and how can you maintain a freedom of choice and still have policy outcomes that get you to the right place. And our culture is not the friendliest to that always, so we have to make sure we're aware of that at all times.
Questions? Gentleman here in the second row here.
Hi, my name is Roy Ying. I'm I'm a student at Berkeley. So thanks for the panelists for the discussion. So my question here is about the sprawl and the rise of city center, as you mentioned. Because autonomous vehicle will potentially let people do anything in their car. So the cost of commute may be decreasing. But that brings the question of sprawl. However, as we mentioned, that the sharing economy could play a big role in this autonomous vehicle market. People may need to live in a place that has enough density to provide demand for sharing autonomous vehicle. That could be a counter effects for sprawl. And those people who live outside of that demand boundary could be the one who uses private autonomous vehicle, and those people could be rich people. What do you think of that? What do you think of the sharing economy's role in this shaping the housing market and cities? Thank you.
Please.
I absolutely agree with you. I think in existing urban centers that will likely be retrofitted to accommodate automated vehicles, absolutely the pressure, even if you are a wealthy household, will be to use a shared system because of the accessibility benefits that arise from that sort of shared system, and that outside, there's going to be more demand for private automated vehicles. Number one, because there may not be the economies of scale to have a shared system, and number two, wealthy households. To be honest, I think for the most part, their demand for privacy goes up, with income. So even if they could have a shared system, they might want their own vehicle anyways. So again, I'm less concerned about sort of the impacts of sprawl per se, just taking up more land. I mean, certainly there could be environmentally sensitive or agriculturally productive areas that get sort of paved over for development, and that might have some social costs. But we're not really going to run out of land in this country, at least anytime soon. I think we only use 3 to 5% of it on a conservative estimate. So I'm not so worried about that. But absolutely. That would be also a good question for the last panel about where some of these ride-sharing companies are thinking about where their economies of scale will and won't work.
I think technology, not just autonomous vehicle. We have a very small business, small office, but we have people that live part-time in other states and still work, and are on trips and still work. And I think that all of this is a whole new fabric of how we do things. In our county, there was a major planning concern about jobs housing balance. Every town, we have a lot of little towns, and every town was to have the same amount of housing as it had jobs. The fact of the matter is you don't dictate where somebody really lives. My son lives in the country and his 4 kids go to school in the city. We live in the city and our kid goes and does something in the country. And I'm hopeful that the autonomous vehicle and probably electrification are going to be a cleaner way to accomplish that. But I don't think you're going to change the footloose nature of our society. I do think what was mentioned before about driving down the street with the wind going through your hair is part and parcel to the nature of cars and identity. But there was an interesting comment made yesterday by Bob Lutz, who was formerly with Chrysler and now with GM, and he basically said that the demise of the individual automobile is probably within the next 20 years. And when you got Bob Lutz saying that, I suspect that there's others in the industry looking at that as well.
I noticed that nobody has talked about the ownership model, although you basically touched upon it, Bob Lutz, talking about the demise of the private automobile. Because in talking with many of the OEMs, they basically see transitioning into a subscription service, leaving aside Tesla and Mercedes, who are probably the only people talking about private AVs. So when we go into a subscription-based service, our issues of parking really become moot, because the whole goal here is to transition from a vehicle efficiency that's currently 4% used, 96% parked, and invert that to basically 96% utilization, 4% parking, servicing, or whatever. So, I mean, to me, the whole question of parking kind of goes away. It becomes like service centers. And so your little car dealer or gas station can actually become your little local community kind of AV service station. Does anybody want to talk about kind of the ownership model? Because a lot about what we're talking about today is predicated upon that ownership model. Jerry Tierney, Perkinsville.
I'll take a shot at it, knowing nothing about it. It strikes me that we've got a society that is moving toward sharing all sorts of things. A timeshare of real estate maybe was one of the early examples, and sharing office space, and I think vehicles and vacation homes and all of those things. What that's going to look like, who's going to do it, I suspect the industry is going to be ahead of the policy. I think it just evolves. But for the first time, you can know things about availability of parking and where you're going, and even in our little town of San Luis, we're in the middle of the debate about who owns the curb. Pizza places or food delivery or being dropped off at the movies, and so we're taking 5 categories, and now we're looking at, do they become 10, or do they become technologically controlled by some data system?
I think just to add a little bit onto that, is also thinking, getting, I guess, back to a bit of the question of the wind blowing in your hair, and thinking of the individuality of American society and people, wanting their Mustang or wanting their Suburban, is that still in this context, there's no reason that everybody has to drive around in the little blob kind of thing that Google has had their picture out there, right? You can still have something that's a sexy car, and you can rent that and be seen in that, and then the next day you can get the red version of that sexy car.
Order it up.
Yeah.
Order up like
Yeah, exactly. And so you can still have that freedom of choice. Is right now I want to be in a yellow car, or I want to have a pickup truck, whatever that tickling your fancy. So I think there's a real potential in that ownership model or shared model that there's actually an opportunity for more individuality. But it doesn't have to be owned by a TNC. There's also a possible of a cooperative. Like my neighborhood, we've got a cooperative of 15 cars that we all share, and then we can use those, and then we have a bit more sense of ownership, or like you don't have to worry about some random kid puking in the car and nobody cleaning it up. Like you have that neighborhood kind of thing. So I think that's some of what that I've been thinking about, is like what are these different models beyond simply taking an Uber or owning the car. There's a wide variation.
So we have time for one very quick last question. Yeah.
The one comment to wind in the hair, it's whenever you're thinking about this, think about what you're gaining, as you were just speaking to, as opposed to what you're giving up. So instead of going with your baby to the drive-in movie, you are now watching a movie while the car is driving you around. It's like there's so many things to gain. But my question for all of you is, this has been an amazing panel and so heartening to me. And there have been a lot of great ideas, especially along the lines of, what do you want your city to be? Have you thought about forming a team and going out to cities and talking to them about how we could best reapportion our buildings, how to think about parking, how our developer fees could be used in other ways to benefit people and the cities that you're building buildings in? Please do that.
Well, I'll give a little plug for the University of Oregon here, and Urbanism Next. Go to our blog, urbanismnext.uoregon.edu. You can kind of see some of the team that we're building, and we're hiring more people to do just that, because I think that's something that we have thought is really vital. But we also don't see it as something that we own per se. That's why we're here. That's why we're having a conference in March to bring more people into the fold, why we had a conference back in April to do the same kind of thing, because I think it's something that is vital, and the cities are really demanding it. We're getting lots and lots and lots of demand from the cities, and beginning to get demand from states and from philanthropic organizations that are also interested in that topic. So I'm happy to partner with anybody here. Yes.
Plug number 2, which is I'm an advisor on Offsites.com, which is a economic development, real estate development platform that basically looks to kind of change the culture of real estate and basically own the real estate conversation. And it's where you can connect with people, share ideas, post projects, and it's still a little bit in formation in terms of its usability, but that's what OpSites is trying to accomplish, is exactly that, but have a whole kind of global conversation around these issues. That's plugging.
So I'm going to play Taskmaster now and bring it back to, I'm going to ask if you all would just bear with us. You've been sitting there for an hour, and hold tight. And I'm going to ask, we're going to do things a little different. Sorry, organizing committee. I'm going to ask all of you to come to the front, and we're going to do a little exercise. And this is going to be my way of keeping things rolling since we're running a little behind. And also inviting us all to participate in a little exercise. So, thank you very much. And Melissa, if you would stay up here as a member of our organizing committee. So while they're coming up, what we're going to do here is I'm going to invite you to help in visioning, and maybe this dips into a little bit of professorialism and a little bit of my teaching style, but I'm going to ask you to take out some pen and paper. Please come up, organizing committee. And what we're all going to do now is I'm going to ask each of these individuals who've contributed hours of their time in helping us plan this event, and I do apologize for putting you all on the spot. Asha, please, I'll get out of the way. I'm going to ask all of us to spend 5 minutes and do two things. I'd like you to just write a sentence about what you can do now from a policy standpoint, from an action standpoint. So what you can do now over the next week to take action on something that you heard today. And then I'm going to ask you that what you can do in the next 6 months to take action on something you heard today. And I'm going to ask you to write it and you to formulate your own, you to ideate your own ideas. But I'm going to ask our panelists here who really are experts, and I think that this really tears off of the last question very well, because everyone you've seen today has written about this, has thought about this, and all of us work together. We've worked on a series of events. We work with cities. We work in practice. We work throughout California, Oregon, Washington. Many of us were in Washington, D.C. with the League of Cities and American Planning Association talking about these things a couple weeks ago. And we have their support. We have their ear. So what can we do now? What can we do in 6 months? So I'd like you to spend a couple minutes just writing your thoughts about that. And organizing committee, thank you. There are a handful of people that are not up here, but I'm going to ask you to share your two thoughts. What can you do now over the next week to take action on something that you've heard today? And then what can we do over the next 6 months? All right? So we're talking about near-term policy solutions. We're just going to sit here and be quiet for a couple minutes and think. All right, so if you can't stick around, please do. I'm getting us, because we do have some refreshments outside, and I want to make sure that you all can partake in that, and I know everybody wants to network and talk. So I'm going to ask us to do two things now. I'm going to ask our panelists here to kind of share their thoughts, but I ask you, if you engage in some kind of social media, if you engage in some kind of platform that allows you to converse with people outside of this audience, what I invite you to do is to share that via your social channel. We have a lot of Twitter goons up here, as I like to refer to them, at Nico Larco and at M. Boswell and at Billy Riggs, and I don't know you people, but we invite you, we invite you to share your thoughts, and if you can use the hashtag AVCity, AVCITY, we look forward to hearing what you have to say. So without further ado, let me just ask the panel to share their thoughts. Maybe we can start with you, Asha. And if you could just introduce yourself as well, because some of you we haven't heard from, and I'd love to hear for you to introduce yourself and be recognized for your actions.
Hello, I'm Asha Weinstein-Agrawal from the Mineta Transportation Institute at San Jose State, where I'm also a city planning professor. One of the things that strikes me that we can all do today, not even within the next week, is just start talking with people, not in a professional context, but even in our own just personal lives, your neighbors, your friends, your kids, whatever, about what do autonomous vehicles mean for the city? And how is that going to change our world? I also think that something that we can do longer term that would take a little bit more organization, because I was actually tasked to think about sort of the social impacts today as I was listening, is, you know, those of us in the room are in some ways diverse, but in other ways not. And so how do we make a sort of explicit, careful effort to start having that visioning conversation with people from all different walks of life, including the people who often get left out of kind of traditional city planning type processes. The last thing I would suggest, which was sort of interesting to me in thinking about all this and envisioning where we go from now, is to try to break out of a lot of the assumptions we have. So, of course, for forever, it seems, you know, we assumed that there was a person driving a vehicle, and so now we're all talking about, well, what if that's not the case? But I think there are an awful lot of other assumptions we aren't questioning, such as what is a vehicle? You know, is it this thing that carries 3 to 5 people and a bunch of luggage, for example, and everything's more or less into a few categories? Or will you just suddenly have dozens of vehicle shapes and forms and purposes? And the other one I'll end here is, because I'm interested in how we pay for things, there's been an assumption, I think, that AVs will become cheap and they will make travel cheap. But that is partially a technology issue and partially a choice about how we choose to tax vehicles traveling on our streets. So I will throw out, just as a sort of counter whatever, what if we made it really expensive per mile? And that's recouping social externalities, whatever other reasons, and then invested that money in making alternatives to traveling in an AV cheap, convenient, and pleasant. And how would that change the equity and the social benefits that come out of this whole system?
All right, cool. I'm Jerry Tierney with Perkins & Will, also director of our mobility lab. I got 2 kind of quick actions. One, I just started this yesterday at Perkins & Will, causing consternation. Many of you people, maybe in private employment, are aware of like WageWorks and commuter benefits, and you get the commuter benefit checks, which uses pre-tax dollars to kind of subsidize getting a Clipper card or whatever, but it also, you can use that to subsidize parking at the same rate. And I thought that is the most ridiculous and asinine thing in this day and age. So at Perkins & Will, I'm leading a campaign to do away with that. And I did get kind of legal advice from our corporate counsel and accountants that it's not actually a tax code requirement, it is discretionary. So that is one thing that I'm going to lead on Perkins & Will. I'll piss off a lot of people who all drive and get subsidized parking, but hey, life's like that. The second action here is something that kept on coming up as a theme today, which is let's design the city we want. Not even talking about AVs, but what is the city we want? And key to this is not letting technology drive the way, okay? But what we need for you to do is the people in city staff, by and large, they get it. The DOTs, they get it. The Salita Reynolds down in LA, she gets it. The heads of state DOTs, they get it. But they're all basically civil service. We were talking, I mean, you're saying about let's kind of like tax, vehicles, VMTs at very high sort of luxury rate. That's going to require a policy decision, and that's going to require decisions made by politicians. Politicians only move when their constituents force them to move. We are all of the constituents. So if we want any of these policy decisions to be implemented, we have to force the politicians. So we have to start as a grassroots movement, say, this is the city we want. We are not going to let technology lead the way. We're going to lead the way. The cities own those streets. The cities own the curbs. And we are going to dictate how the street and the curb is used, and we're going to tell the politicians. And the politicians will reluctantly, because we all know they lead from behind, there go my constituents, I must follow them. That's how the legislation will pass. So that is our action over the next 6 months, 6 years, or however long it takes.
Thank you. Nico Larco again from University of Oregon Sustainable Cities Initiatives and Urbanism Next. The immediate thing echoes a lot of what we talked about here earlier on. is bring more people into the conversation, pull back the curtain. I don't think it takes a lot. We have enough data out there right now, and there's enough resources that you can have conversations with people. What was described before, can you talk to cities about this? Yes. It doesn't take much to talk to cities and get them tremendously frightened, and all of a sudden you get their attention. I think a second really important part of that is that you coordinate around that. So pull back the curtain and then make sure you say, okay, so you DOT needs to be talking to planning and sustainability, and you need to be talking to your local DOT, and you need to be talking to whatever municipal kind of organization there is. You need to be talking to your housing advocates, and so on and so forth. So bring people into those conversations. I would say that it's important to do that across disciplines, across departments, across interests, and I think it's also important to be doing that to our politicians. In Oregon, we've just now, last month, started talking about campaigns, maybe too strong of a word, but picking out key politicians at the state level that might have an interest in these topics and starting to educate them about it's not just a transportation issue, right? And getting them to understand the broad range of constituencies that might be important to this, so that when we get to legislation, there's not this, well, okay, sure, what's the business interest telling us about? The larger 6-month kind of goal for us with Urbanism Next is we're working on a clearinghouse, because there's a lot of a year and a half ago, there was not a lot of information out there, and now there's starting to be a lot more research out there that's related to these topics, these secondary effects, not the technologies, but these secondary effects. And so what we think is really important is to put together a place where all that information is coming together, and it's curated, it's organized by what my interest is. Am I coming from the housing side? Am I interested in parking issues? Am I interested in land valuation? That can be a guide for people, and that's a goal that we've got in these next 6 months. So yeah, lots of work to do.
Great. So my name's Josh Carlin-Resnick with Nelson Nygaard, and we're transportation planning consultants. I think the short-term thing, and I want to echo a lot of what other folks have said. I think broadening the conversation from folks like those of us in this room to everyday citizens, some of whom have read a lot of the hot air in the media and may have wild hopes for what this technology might bring, but maybe aren't as aware of the potential downsides. And if they're not, then we're more likely, if a broad base of people, of our voters, the people who are actually pushing politicians to do what they do, are not warning them about not wanting to see an erosion of quality of life in cities or a walling off of pedestrians from the right-of-way in which vehicles travel, which is a real potential. We did that 100 years ago when we planned our cities for automobiles. So anyway, I think that in the next week, I'm not sure I can quite get that going, but I think we all can start at least the effort to push our local cities and agencies and others to start the conversation at the, sort of the everyday public level, because I think that's been missing to date. I think over the slightly longer term, again, trying to combat a little bit of the hot air and the speculation and start to bring it down to earth. I think something that I'm focused on is trying to find data and or get data out into the world on what is actually happening already with TNCs, with the Ubers and the Lyfts, which, as Tilly said earlier from the SFCTA, they are sort of the beta test of what AVs might look like. They are the situation where we don't have to have a parking space necessarily. We can maybe take a private vehicle from one door to the other. And so what are the implications of that, and how do we manage that? How do we encourage the use of those types of services that creates positive externalities as opposed to really negative externalities like increases in congestion and the like? So I think finding data on what's actually happening today and be able, put some truth to a lot of the, sort of long-term graphs that create a range of many possible outcomes, because that's just, we don't have data, and so that's what we have available, but we need to start bringing some rigor to that.
Great, those are all wonderful ideas. I'm going to speak maybe a little bit to my fellow city planners in the room, although given that probably most of you are voters and taxpayers in your community, it should be relevant to you as well. But I think there's a few things that we ought to be doing. One is tomorrow, go and open up your capital programs and particularly look at your transportation projects, whether they're roadway widening, parking garages, or what have you, and ask yourself, is this an investment that we're going to have a problem with in the future? Is this a wasted money or potentially a stranded asset in the future? So I think we can sort of do an immediate review of that and begin to think about how we might future-proof these projects that maybe the political demand to keep them is too much to say no to them, but can we make modifications? So that's one thing I would do. A second thing I would do is, I think things have already changed a lot, and they've largely changed because of the transportation network companies. And so in all our communities that are being serviced by Lyft and Uber, we can use that experience to begin to give us a sense of maybe how the future might change, or at least how the changes of those technologies can give us some insight as to the future changes. So if you haven't done it already, every community should be working with those TNCs to get data from them, but also to begin to develop some of your own data and to analyze what has happened in my community in terms of parking demand, in terms of curbside management, in terms of changes to biking and transit use, due to the introduction of this technology. I think it can give us insight into the future. And then finally, and this is probably something that will have to maybe occur over longer term, which is, if you haven't cracked open your land use element of your general plan in a while, maybe now is the time. And to take a look at that, and particularly to see whether the plan, assuming it has some sort of growth or anti-sprawl measures in it, whether those can continue to be effective in the future. A lot of our strategies for controlling sprawl have partly assumed that sprawl will somewhat control itself due to the friction of space. Well, if that part of the equation is gone, are the regulations and the policies you're left with strong enough to counteract that, or do they need to be modified in some way? So that's obviously a much bigger lift, and it's harder to completely sort of foresee the future, but certainly now's the time to start that.
So I think I'll ignore my notes here and ask you to consider a question that that Professor Agarwal, another professor I had the pleasure of studying under at San Jose State, made me think of. So if AVs are offered for free in Phoenix, let's say, which is a very real possibility. Google offers all of their services for free. It's highly probable that they would offer their AVs for free in exchange for viewing ads or going by billboards or something like that. So if AVs are free in many cities, what will that mean for cities at large? We know what happened when free parking was offered in cities. It was never able to be taken back except in the most premier of cities, in the most premier of spaces within those cities. So if AVs are free or dramatically reduce costs around the country before they get to cities, what are we going to do with policy? So I think that's on my mind, and I would love for people in the room to consider it.
So I'll just wrap things up by doing some next steps in terms of the way I viewed what we talked about today, which was amazing. So kind of where do we take things from here? We are going to be working over the next few weeks on developing some policy guidance. All these people up here from this session, what were the key outcomes? So we're going to be doing that. And we're also going to be focusing on, for example, Mike Boswell and I, he doesn't even know this yet, are going to be focusing on some of the other autonomous impacts. For example, we didn't even start dialoguing drones as a part of this. So, when we think about innovation and innovation in cities, it's really innovate X in cities. And so we need to think about, we see this as a longitudinal discussion. So as as we go through the next 6 months, we're at University of San Francisco, and I think at San Jose State, University of Oregon, Cal Poly, Berkeley, Stanford, we're seeing this as an idea of how we innovate all of the places we live, and how we innovate housing, how we innovate logistics, how we innovate government, how we innovate voting. And all of those things are key aspects of how technology, entrepreneurship, business will reframe the places and the way we live. And we need to be having a bigger dialogue about some of that. This was just the start. And so we look forward to continuing that dialogue, whether or not it's March at the Urbanism Next conference, which is really just the next step, and I think where a lot of us are going to participate in, but also inviting our, if you want to talk to us, any of us individually, whether we're open to that, so please reach out. A lot of us have published a lot in this area and are continuing to do research in this area, and we'd be happy to work with you as a city, as a consulting firm, and to talk with you more about our thoughts and the way we see things going. So with that said, I want to just offer some thank yous and then invite you to, we do have a reception and we will invite you. I need to do a big thank you to these people up here who helped me and Mike and I really ideate and make this event happen. Not on the stage, we had Hillary Nixon and Karen Philbrick from the Meta Transportation Institute help out, as well as Andrea Brodus from Bosch, who were big contributors in our planning. But if we could just give these people a round of applause, I would be very grateful. And we had some fantastic sponsors, but I really want to thank our three major sponsors in terms of the Meta Transportation Institute, ARUP, and Cal Poly, as well as University of San Francisco, who really made this happen. So thank you for your support, ARUP, MTI, as well as Cal Poly. Thank you so much. Lastly, I do need to thank all the wonderful people who have helped out today, and because there have been many hands, and I'm not going to say I don't know even all the people that have helped. A couple people I know, Matt Kawashima is my grad student and helped. Therese Perez is here and has been helpful as well. There was Joellen. Where are you, Joellen? Is Joellen here? So Joellen had to take off, but Joellen is our program assistant here. Jennifer Hogan has been the person wandering around the room, making sure everything went well. And I would be remiss, and she deserves a big round of applause. LaShonda, can you please just wave at everybody and just, everyone needs to express gratefulness to LaShonda. She made a lot of sacrifices to make this happen, including these nice books. And we do invite you, these are free, we invite you to take them as a token of our appreciation for you being here. And with that said, I'm going to actually draw one of these cards, and I already did it. So we're going to work with, I'm going to mispronounce your name, probably Athena Lumu from Skidmore, if you're here. So we'll talk afterwards, but we're going to work on getting you some special treatment and a trip to Tesla and an AV as a part of what we did. And so thank you for being here again. I have one more little announcement. LaShonda's going to shake her finger at me and tell me, don't forget this, is that we invite you over here to have some refreshments. However, we do have a class in one of these rooms starting at 6, so we're just going to ask that you respect that class, and we're going to try to truncate that and finish up at least by 6, and we invite you to continue your socialization and networking at dinner. So thank you for being here. We look forward to seeing you in the future.